I never told my daughter's fiancé I was the man driving him to work. He never looked twice at me. Then one morning I overheard his plan for my daughter. I could not believe my ears. My name is Edgar Rollins, and I am 68 years old. As a man who built an empire from the ground up, I learned early on that wealth attracts predators. To protect my daughter Naomi from gold diggers, I raised her in a modest house and hid my fortune. She thinks I am just a hard-working driver. Her fiancé Trent Lawson thinks I am an invisible piece of furniture. Last Tuesday, I drove Trent to his financial firm. What happened in the back of my car initiated the total destruction of his life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father's instinct is never wrong. Rain battered the windshield of the black Lincoln Town car. The rear door yanked open, and Trent Lawson threw his dripping raincoat directly onto the passenger seat. He did not say good morning. He did not acknowledge my existence. He dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the floorboard and kicked his mud-stained Oxfords hard against the back of my driver's seat. I gripped the steering wheel. The leather groaned under the pressure of my hands. I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Trent adjusted his expensive silk tie. He was a 30-year-old financial investment manager. He was white-privileged and entirely convinced the world owed him its obedience. To him, I was just an aging African-American chauffeur. He saw the gray hair at my temples and the cheap uniform jacket I wore. He saw a servant. He did not see the owner of the vehicle. He did not see the majority shareholder of the logistics firm that employed the very fleet he hired. He certainly did not see his future father-in-law. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. Trent immediately took out his phone. He treated the space inside the car as his private, soundproof booth. People like Trent never assume the help has ears. They treat service workers like invisible ghosts. That arrogance became his fatal flaw. Trent dialed a number and pressed the phone to his ear. His usual confident posture collapsed. He hunched over, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. He was speaking to a man named Dominic. The conversation was not about mutual funds or corporate bonds. Trent was begging. He pleaded for a 1-month extension on a $500,000 gambling debt. The voice on the other end must have issued a violent threat because Trent gripped the door handle in sheer panic. He swore he had the money guaranteed. He laid out his entire exit strategy right there in my back seat. He explained he was marrying a naive girl named Naomi in exactly 4 weeks. He promised Dominic that immediately after the wedding he would exercise his spousal rights to force Naomi to sell her late grandmother's estate. The blood roared in my ears. That estate was not just a rundown suburban property. I bought that house 40 years ago with my late wife Evelyn. Before Evelyn passed away, I sat by her hospital bed and swore on my life that I would protect Naomi from the vultures of this world. That house held the key to a $50 million trust fund I had legally secured solely for Naomi. Trent did not love my daughter. He was hunting her. He viewed Naomi as nothing more than a sacrificial lamb to save his own knees from being shattered by cartel enforcers. I maintained a steady speed. I signaled a lane change. My face remained a mask of complete indifference. I had spent 40 years surviving the most vicious boardrooms in Chicago. I knew better than to reveal my hand before the trap was fully set. I listened as Trent laughed nervously, promising the loan shark that Naomi would sign whatever paper he placed in front of her. He called my daughter weak. He called her easily manipulated. Every word he spoke sealed his impending doom. The Lincoln glided to a halt in front of the towering glass facade of his financial firm. Trent ended the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. He grabbed his briefcase and pushed the door open before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt. He marched into the rain without a backward glance. I shifted the car into park and turned around to clean the mud he left behind. A crumpled piece of paper lay on the custom floor mat. It must have fallen from his pocket during his frantic scramble. I picked it up and smoothed out the creases. It was a purchase receipt from an exclusive jeweler in the Diamond District. The total was $50,000 paid in cash. The item was a custom-cut platinum engagement ring. The ring size clearly printed at the bottom was a size 6. I stared at the number. The engine hummed quietly beneath me. Naomi wears a size 8. She has my hands. She has always worn a size 8. Trent was heavily in debt to violent criminals, yet he had $50,000 in untraceable cash to purchase a diamond ring for a woman with much smaller hands. Trent possessed a mistress. He was funding a secret life while actively plotting to steal my daughter's future. I folded the receipt and placed it carefully into my breast pocket. I could not simply drive to Naomi's apartment and expose him right now. She was deeply in love. She was blinded by the charming facade Trent projected. Presenting this crumpled piece of paper without solid context would only make me look like a paranoid old man trying to ruin her happiness. Trent would twist the narrative. He would play the victim. I needed absolute proof. I needed to wrap the evidence around his neck like an iron chain. I put the car in gear and drove away from the curb. The silent chauffeur was dead. The father was going to war. I needed to find out exactly who this mistress was and how deep this betrayal went. If I made one wrong move, Naomi would hate me forever. I had to let Trent think he was winning. I had to let him dig his own grave deep enough so that he could never climb out. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm I was about to unleash on his life. The damp cloth squeaked against the leather steering wheel. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. The caller ID flashed my daughter's face. I wiped my hands on my dark trousers and answered the call. Naomi's voice poured through the speaker. She sounded breathless and radiant. She told me Trent had surprised her with an urgent proposal. She explained that Trent consulted a high-end spiritual guide that morning. This supposed mystic advised him that their original wedding date carried terrible energy. Trent insisted they move the ceremony up by exactly 2 weeks to capture auspicious feng shui. Naomi laughed as she shared the news. She thought her fiancé was being incredibly romantic and fiercely protective of their future together. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I congratulated her on the new date. I told her I would adjust my driving schedule to help with the final preparations. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. The interior of the Lincoln felt suffocating. Auspicious feng shui was a desperate lie. I knew the exact reason Trent needed to accelerate the timeline. The loan sharks had given him a strict 1-month deadline to clear a $500,000 gambling debt. Our original wedding date fell dangerously close to the expiration of that grace period. Moving the ceremony up by 2 weeks gave Trent a crucial buffer. He needed to secure the marriage certificate immediately. That piece of paper gave him legal leverage over Naomi's assets. He planned to force her to sell her late grandmother's estate the moment they returned from their honeymoon. He needed the cash to save his own knees from being shattered by cartel enforcers. My daughter was not a bride to him. She was a human shield. Trent was weaponizing her love to bail himself out of a lethal underworld debt. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I could not simply drive to her apartment and expose him right now. Naomi was blinded by the charming facade Trent projected so effortlessly. If a poor aging chauffeur accused her wealthy, successful fiancé of being a degenerate gambler, she would defend Trent. She would label me a paranoid old man trying to sabotage her happiness. Trent would twist the narrative and play the victim. He would isolate her from me completely. I needed airtight proof. I needed a weapon sharp enough to cut through his lies instantly. I started the engine. The time for passive observation was over. I drove the Lincoln out of the financial district and headed toward the industrial edge of the city. I swiped an encrypted keycard over a hidden scanner near an abandoned-looking warehouse. A heavy steel door rolled upward. I drove down a steep concrete ramp into a heavily guarded underground facility. This bunker sat directly beneath one of the commercial towers owned by Rollins Logistics Worldwide. Armed security personnel in tactical gear nodded respectfully as I parked the car. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing my cheap chauffeur uniform. I walked into a glass-enclosed office bathed in stark white light. Oliver Thorne stood waiting by a metal conference table. Oliver was my chief legal counsel and my most ruthless operative. I pulled my worn leather wallet from my pocket. I extracted a faded photograph of my late wife, Evelyn. I stared at her gentle face. Evelyn passed away when Naomi was only 7 years old. As the cancer ravaged her body, Evelyn made me swear a sacred oath. She knew my rapidly growing empire would attract parasites. She made me promise to protect our daughter from the predators who hunt wealth. I kept that promise by building a fortress of illusion. I raised Naomi in a modest suburban home. I drove a beat-up sedan. I made her take out student loans and work a regular job. I wanted her to build character and resilience. She grew up believing we were a simple working-class family. She has absolutely no idea that her father controls a billion-dollar supply chain network. She has no idea she is the sole beneficiary of a $50 million blind trust. Trent discovered a minor piece of her inheritance by snooping through public records. He found the deed to her grandmother's modest estate. Trent believes he is stealing a suburban house. He does not realize he is poking a sleeping dragon. I put Evelyn's picture back in my wallet. I looked at Oliver. I needed to know exactly who Trent was buying a $50,000 diamond ring for. I needed the name of the mistress. I needed to understand the full anatomy of the trap Trent had set for my child. Oliver slid a thick manila folder across the cold metal table. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened the file and laid out a series of high-resolution photographs and bank records. His forensic accounting team had tracked the crumpled receipt I found on the floorboard of my car. The $50,000 transaction was paid entirely in untraceable cash, but the delivery address left a digital footprint. The jeweler dispatched a bonded courier to a luxury penthouse suite in the downtown district. Oliver tapped a photograph showing a woman signing for the package. She had blonde hair and wore designer clothes. The camera captured a clear shot of her face as she slipped the size 6 diamond ring onto her finger. I stared at the photograph. The air in the room turned to ice. I recognized the woman instantly. It was Vanessa. She was the high-end wedding planner Naomi had hired 3 months ago. Naomi spoke about Vanessa constantly. Naomi trusted her explicitly. They spent hours together choosing floral arrangements, tasting cake samples, and touring venues. Naomi considered Vanessa a close friend and confidant in the stressful planning process. The reality was utterly sickening. Trent was sleeping with the woman organizing his wedding. Vanessa was not just a mistress. She was an active co-conspirator. She was embedded deeply inside my daughter's inner circle. Vanessa was steering Naomi toward the most expensive vendor options, draining Naomi's personal savings, while secretly wearing a diamond ring bought with stolen money. They were laughing at my daughter behind her back. They were orchestrating her financial ruin from the inside out. The enemy was not just at the gates. The enemy was writing the guest list. I closed the folder. The rage inside me hardened into absolute clarity. Exposing Trent was no longer enough. I was going to dismantle his entire existence. I was going to turn his arrogance into ashes. I instructed Oliver to initiate the next phase of our countermeasure. The silent chauffeur was about to take control of the wheel. The decoy house sat at the end of a dead-end street in a quiet working-class neighborhood. I bought the property 20 years ago solely to maintain the illusion of my modest life. The paint peeled off the front porch in long white strips. The gutters sagged under the heavy weight of accumulated dead leaves and seasonal neglect. I heard the sharp crunch of expensive tires on the cracked gravel driveway. Trent parked his sleek imported sports car, taking up 2 entire spaces. He stepped out into the damp morning air and immediately checked the soles of his polished shoes for mud. He walked up to my front door, looking around as if the air itself might contaminate his lungs. I opened the door before he could knock. He did not greet me. He stepped over the threshold and scanned the small living room with undisguised disgust. The furniture was secondhand. The carpet was worn thin near the hallway. He refused to take off his expensive wool coat. I walked into the narrow kitchen and offered him a glass of tap water. I held out a slightly chipped glass. Trent stared at the water as if I were handing him a cup of liquid poison. He shook his head and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. He did not come here to exchange pleasantries. He came to collect a debt he felt entitled to. I pointed to the old armchair in the corner of the room. He carefully dusted the fabric seat with his hand before sitting down. I sat on the opposite sofa. I waited in absolute silence. I knew exactly how to negotiate with corporate sharks. The first person to speak always loses the tactical advantage. Trent shifted uncomfortably under my steady gaze. He expected a subservient chauffeur. He expected a broken old man eager to please his wealthy future son-in-law. He cleared his throat and leaned forward. The arrogance quickly replaced his initial discomfort. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and prepared to drop his trap. Trent wasted no time getting to his ultimate point. He told me his family was growing increasingly concerned about the optics of the upcoming wedding. He stated clearly that his parents were accustomed to a certain standard of high society living. He looked around my living room again, letting his heavy silence insult my home. He then claimed his family was seriously considering canceling the wedding entirely if the bride's side appeared destitute and unrefined. The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. He was holding my daughter's happiness hostage based on a completely fabricated class divide. He leaned back into the armchair and delivered his ultimatum. He demanded I contribute $100,000 to the wedding fund by the end of the week. He framed the extortion as a necessary deposit to save Naomi from public humiliation. I sat perfectly still in my frayed flannel shirt. The fabric was thin and the cuffs were heavily worn from years of use. Right above my heart there was a clumsy, uneven patch of dark blue thread. Naomi sewed that patch for me 10 years ago when she was just a teenager learning to mend clothes. She pricked her finger twice, making it. I value this battered shirt more than my entire corporate collection of bespoke Italian suits. Trent looked at the patch and sneered. He saw a pathetic old man who could not afford new clothes. He had absolutely no idea that a single phone call from the man wearing this shirt could obliterate his entire financial firm. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply asked him how a working-class driver was supposed to produce $100,000 in a matter of days. Trent smiled a predatory, wicked smile. He told me to mortgage this house. He had already researched the property value. He had the official paperwork drawn up and waiting in his leather briefcase. He wanted me to sign away my home to fund his lethal gambling debt. I looked at the forged mortgage documents he slid across the scratched coffee table. I did not reach out to touch them. I looked back at Trent and let a slow, defeated sigh escape my lips. I played the part of a cornered, desperate father perfectly. I told him I would not mortgage my home, but I had access to a secret retirement fund. I told him I could provide the $100,000 to secure my daughter's future. Trent's eyes lit up with sheer, unadulterated greed. The sheer panic of his underworld debts melted away into arrogant relief. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slip of paper with his personal banking routing number. I shook my head slowly. I told him I would only release the funds directly to the wedding vendors. I insisted on wiring the money straight to the luxury catering company and the high-end florist Naomi had selected. Trent's face drained of all color instantly. The smug, victorious smile vanished from his lips. He stammered that his family needed the liquid cash to manage the overall budget. He tried to argue aggressively that direct payments would complicate their complex accounting. I remained completely immovable. I stated firmly that my bank required direct vendor invoices for sums of that magnitude. Trent stood up abruptly. His breathing grew shallow and rapid. He realized he could not extract the hard cash he needed to pay the violent loan sharks. He snatched his paperwork from the table and stormed out of my house without another word. He slammed the front door so hard the framed pictures on the wall rattled against the plaster. I watched his car speed away down the street, leaving a trail of dust. I knew he would retaliate viciously. The retaliation came the very next morning. My phone rang at dawn. It was Naomi. She was crying hysterically. Trent had spent the entire night twisting the narrative. He convinced my daughter that I treated him like a common beggar. He told her I humiliated his family by refusing to trust him with the wedding funds. Naomi yelled at me through her heavy tears. She accused me of trying to sabotage her wedding because I was secretly jealous of Trent's success. She said she could not look at me right now. She hung up the phone before I could speak a single word in my defense. Trent had successfully turned my own flesh and blood against me. He weaponized her deep love and used it as an impenetrable shield. I lowered the phone to the table. The game was no longer about simple exposure. It was about absolute, total destruction. The phone went dead in my hand. The silence in my dark kitchen was absolute. Trent had played his opening gambit flawlessly. He isolated my daughter and positioned himself as her sole protector. I took a slow breath and let the bitter reality settle in my bones. I had spent decades crushing corporate rivals in boardrooms across the globe. I knew when a tactical retreat was necessary for survival. I dialed her number again. She answered on the fourth ring. Her breathing was ragged and defensive. I swallowed my pride. I told her I was an old fool. I told her the stress of giving her away had clouded my judgment. I lied through my teeth and apologized for insulting the man she loved. Naomi softened slightly. She accepted my apology, but the warmth in her voice was entirely gone. She told me Trent graciously agreed to let me continue driving him to work. I thanked her. I ended the call and stared at my reflection in the window. Evelyn used to tell me my pride would be my downfall. I proved her wrong today. My pride was dead. Only the mission remained. The next morning, I parked the Lincoln outside Trent's townhouse. The rain had cleared, but the air was freezing. Trent stepped out wearing a tailored navy suit and a smirk that made my trigger finger twitch. He slid into the back seat. He did not say good morning. He simply tapped the partition glass twice. It was a command meant for a dog. I put the car in drive. I watched his smug face in the rearview mirror. He thought he had broken me. He thought the old driver was utterly defeated. He felt so invincible he made his next fatal error immediately. He ordered me to reroute to a luxury apartment complex in the Arts District. I knew the address perfectly. Oliver had traced the $50,000 diamond ring to that exact building. Trent was going to pick up his mistress. I pulled the heavy vehicle smoothly up to the glass doors of the high-rise. A woman stood under the awning. She wore a sleek beige trench coat and oversized sunglasses. I recognized her instantly from the wedding planning sessions Naomi had shown me on her phone. Her name was Vanessa. She was the high-end wedding planner Naomi trusted completely. Vanessa climbed into the back seat and threw herself onto Trent. They crashed together in a hungry, aggressive kiss. They did not care about the driver sitting 2 feet away in the front. To them, I was part of the upholstery. I kept my eyes on the road and my breathing shallow. Trent pulled away and stroked her hair. He told her she looked beautiful. She laughed and slapped his chest playfully. She asked him about the suburban house. Trent sneered. He told her the old man folded like a cheap lawn chair. He bragged about dominating my daughter and securing the funds. Then Vanessa reached into her designer bag. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. These were the catering and floral contracts Naomi was supposed to review tonight. Vanessa slid a single extra page into the very center of the stack. She tapped it with her manicured fingernail. She told Trent the forged prenuptial agreement was perfectly hidden between the liability clauses. She explained that Naomi would sign the bottom of the stack without reading the fine print. Once she signed, Trent would have total unchecked authority over her finances and her properties. Trent kissed Vanessa again. He praised her brilliance. He promised her a 2-week vacation in the Maldives the moment the ink was dry. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. Evelyn and I built our entire life on a handshake and a promise. We had nothing but absolute trust. This man was using the sacred institution of marriage to execute a hostile corporate takeover of my daughter's life. I did not blink. I did not make a sound. I reached out with a steady hand and pressed a small, unmarked button beneath the dashboard console. The green light flickered twice. The military-grade microphones embedded in the leather headrests activated silently. Every whisper, every laugh, and every criminal intention was captured in crystal-clear high-definition audio. I recorded the entire conversation. I dropped them off at a discreet coffee shop near the financial district. Trent tossed a $20 bill onto the front seat without looking at me. He told me to fetch the car in an hour. I waited until they disappeared inside the building. I picked up the encrypted hard drive connected to the console. The audio file was flawless. This was the absolute proof I needed. I pulled out my phone and opened my message thread with Naomi. I prepared to send the file. I was going to detonate Trent's life right now. My thumb hovered over the send button. Suddenly, my dashboard screen flashed red. It was a high-priority encrypted call from Oliver. I answered immediately. Oliver's voice was tense and sharp. He told me to hold my fire. He had just intercepted a massive wire transfer flag through the banking network. Trent had spent the previous evening doing more than just manipulating Naomi's emotions. He had leveraged her guilt to prove her absolute commitment to their future. Oliver explained that Naomi had just emptied her entire personal savings account. She transferred every cent she had ever earned into a joint investment portfolio. Oliver confirmed the worst detail. Trent was the primary account holder. The money was fully under his control. I stared at the audio file on my phone screen. The trap had suddenly reversed. If I sent the recording to Naomi right now, the wedding would be canceled. Trent would realize he was exposed. He would instantly wire Naomi's life savings to the cartel to save his own life. He would vanish and leave her completely bankrupt. I could not pull the trigger. Revealing the truth at this exact moment would destroy my daughter financially. I slowly deleted the draft message. I put the phone back in my pocket. The monster was holding my daughter's livelihood hostage. I had to freeze his assets before I broke his neck. I sat in the driver's seat of the Lincoln, staring at the flashing red light on my encrypted phone. Oliver Thorne spoke clearly through the quiet cabin, detailing the exact moment Naomi wired her entire life savings into Trent Lawson's joint account. Trent was minutes away from liquidating her future to pay his mob debts. I did not panic. I simply instructed Oliver to execute the Shadow Protocol. 30 years ago, when Rollins Logistics Worldwide began generating massive liquid assets, I purchased a controlling interest in First Fidelity Trust. It was the exact same bank Trent used to set up the fraudulent joint account. I remained a silent, anonymous majority shareholder. I was a ghost in their corporate registry. Trent had no idea he was moving stolen money through my personal vault. I ordered Oliver to bypass the standard branch managers and go directly to the bank internal security director. We flagged Trent's specific routing number for high-level suspicious activity. Oliver initiated a Level 5 fraud investigation alert. Within 60 seconds, the joint account was completely paralyzed. The digital funds were locked behind thick layers of federal banking red tape. Trent could look at the massive balance on his computer screen, but he could not withdraw a single cent. He could not transfer the money. He could not close the account. Naomi's hard-earned savings were effectively trapped in a digital purgatory. More importantly, her money was entirely safe from Trent's greedy hands. I ended the call with Oliver and gripped the steering wheel. I had successfully severed Trent's primary financial lifeline. I knew the immediate consequences of this decisive action. Trent would experience a catastrophic meltdown. He was a cornered rat facing dangerous predators, and I had just snatched away his only escape route. I started the engine and drove into the slick city streets, preparing for the inevitable fallout. I arrived at my private penthouse office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The room was submerged in heavy shadows. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I walked toward the massive mahogany desk and gripped the edge as a sudden vicious pain tore through my chest. The pain radiated down my left arm and settled deep in my ribs like a jagged piece of glass. I pulled open the top drawer and retrieved a small amber prescription bottle. My hands, usually as steady as polished steel, shook violently as I spilled 2 white pills onto the wood surface. I swallowed them dry. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing into a slow, measured rhythm. The physical toll of this covert war was rapidly catching up to my aging body. My cardiologist had warned me last month that my heart was operating on borrowed time. He insisted on immediate surgery and absolute rest. Rest was a luxury I could not afford. The agonizing stress of watching Naomi willingly walk into a predator's trap was killing me faster than any medical condition. Every time Trent looked at my daughter with his fake charming smile, my blood pressure spiked. Every time Naomi aggressively defended him, my heart fractured. I refused to collapse. I refused to let my body fail before my mission was complete. I poured a glass of cold water and drank it down, waiting for the strong medication to force my heart rate back to a normal tempo. I looked at the framed photograph of Evelyn on my desk. I promised her I would keep our daughter safe from the exact kind of monster Trent Lawson proved to be. A hospital bed would only render me useless. I could not fight a brutal war from a sterile recovery room. I straightened my posture and smoothed the wrinkles from my cheap chauffeur uniform. I was not a sick old man. I was a father defending his blood, and I had a war to finish. Miles away in his glass-walled office, Trent stared at his computer monitor in absolute disbelief. Hidden cameras in the building's network, accessed by Oliver's security team, broadcasted Trent's meltdown directly to my secure tablet. Trent furiously clicked his mouse, desperately trying to authorize the wire transfer to the cartel. The screen repeatedly flashed a stark red error message indicating the account was frozen pending a severe fraud investigation. He slammed his fists against the keyboard. The panic in his eyes morphed into blind, unhinged rage. He picked up his expensive silver laptop and hurled it across the room. The machine shattered against the tempered glass wall, raining plastic and metal components onto the carpet. His lifeline was officially gone. His cell phone rang immediately. It was Dominic. I listened to the intercepted audio feed as Trent answered with a weak, trembling voice. He begged for just 3 more days. He cried, offering pathetic excuses about banking errors and bureaucratic delays. Dominic did not care about bank errors. The loan shark's voice was a low, terrifying growl. Dominic stated that patience was a commodity Trent could no longer afford. The mobster delivered a chilling ultimatum. He promised to send his men to find Naomi. He explicitly threatened to cut off Naomi's ring finger and mail it to Trent in a small box if the $500,000 debt was not settled in exactly 72 hours. Trent gasped for air. He was a pathetic coward stripped of all his arrogant armor. Instead of protecting his future wife, Trent made the ultimate unforgivable choice. To buy himself a miserable 3-day extension, Trent gave the mobster Naomi's exact home address and the security gate code to her building. He offered my daughter as collateral to violent killers just to save his own skin. The audio feed cut out. The line went dead. Naomi was no longer just dealing with a fraudulent fiancé. She was now a direct physical target for ruthless criminals. Midnight cloaked the city in a thick, freezing fog. The streets around Naomi's apartment building were completely deserted. 3 men stepped out of a rusted sedan parked half a block away. They did not speak a single word. They wore dark clothing and moved with the synchronized, predatory grace of seasoned criminals. Dominic's enforcers had arrived to collect their pound of flesh. Trent's cowardice had bought him 3 days, but it had put these monsters directly on my daughter's doorstep. The lead thug carried a heavy leather roll containing specialized lock-picking tools. The second man patted his dark jacket pocket, verifying the thick plastic zip ties waiting inside. The third man, the largest and most dangerous of the group, palmed a 6-inch serrated hunting knife. They bypassed the well-lit front entrance and slipped down the narrow garbage alley running along the side of the brick building. A heavy wrought iron security gate blocked their path to the rear stairwell. The lead thug knelt in the damp grime and inserted a tension wrench into the locking mechanism. The metallic clicks echoed faintly against the wet brick walls. 3 floors above them, Naomi was sleeping peacefully in her bed. Her bedroom window faced the alleyway. She was completely unaware that the man she planned to marry had traded her physical safety for his own survival. She believed Trent was working late at his financial firm, building their future together. The brutal reality was that Trent had handed these men the exact blueprint to her apartment. The final tumbler in the iron gate snapped into place. The heavy gate swung open with a soft, metallic groan. The 3 men slipped inside the perimeter and drew their weapons. They stepped into the dimly lit rear stairwell, preparing to climb to the 3rd floor. They expected a terrified young woman crying for help. They expected an easy, violent extraction to send a brutal message back to a degenerate gambler. They had absolutely no idea they had just stepped into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. The dense shadows in the stairwell detached themselves from the concrete walls. Oliver's elite shadow security team had been waiting in total darkness for over 4 hours. These were not average bodyguards or corporate rent-a-cops. They were highly trained ex-military operatives. They were men who had conducted high-stakes extraction missions in hostile war zones across the globe. They wore matte black tactical gear and moved without making a single sound. The cartel thugs took exactly 3 steps up the concrete stairs before the trap snapped shut. The ambush was breathtakingly violent and absolutely silent. An operative dropped from the landing above landing squarely on the shoulders of the largest thug. He locked his thick arm around the man's throat in a flawless blood choke, instantly cutting off oxygen to the brain. The thug went limp and dropped his serrated knife. A second operative caught the falling blade mid-air before it could strike the concrete floor and ring out. Simultaneously, 2 more operatives neutralized the remaining hitmen with devastating efficiency. A swift, brutal strike to the solar plexus dropped the lead lockpicker to his knees, gasping silently for air. A heavy tactical boot crushed his ribs, pinning him to the ground, while thick plastic cuffs secured his wrists behind his back. The entire violent engagement lasted less than 12 seconds. The cartel men did not even have the chance to draw a breath to scream. They were dragged out the back service door like heavy sacks of garbage. A modified black utility van idled silently in the alleyway with its headlights off. The side door slid open and the 3 unconscious bodies were thrown roughly onto the cold metal floorboards. The van pulled away seamlessly, blending into the midnight traffic. Oliver had explicit orders regarding these intruders. These men would wake up zip-tied to steel chairs in a windowless warehouse 3 states away. They would be violently interrogated and kept in permanent isolation until my operation against Trent was fully concluded. The stairwell remained perfectly quiet. Not a single drop of blood stained the concrete. Naomi continued to sleep safely above the violence. I watched the entire tactical operation unfold through the tinted windows of an armored SUV parked across the street. The heavy, freezing rain obscured the vehicle entirely from view. I sat in the darkness of the back seat, gripping a vintage silver lighter in my right hand. It was the specific lighter Evelyn had given me on our very first wedding anniversary. I squeezed the solid metal casing with such immense, unrelenting force that the sharp engraved edges cut deeply into my palm. Warm blood pooled in my hand and dripped slowly onto the immaculate leather seat. I felt absolutely no physical pain. I only felt a cold, calculating wrath radiating through my veins. The man my daughter loved had deliberately sent armed killers to mutilate her. I wrapped a dark handkerchief around my bleeding hand and ordered my driver to take me home. The sun rose over Chicago, casting a pale gray light across the morning city. At exactly 8 o'clock, Trent sprinted up the front steps to Naomi's apartment building. His face was slick with terrified sweat. He expected to find a gruesome crime scene. He expected flashing police lights, yellow tape, and a weeping, traumatized bride missing her ring finger. He punched in the security code with trembling fingers and shoved the front door open. Naomi stood in the warm kitchen, wearing her bathrobe, pouring a cup of fresh coffee. She smiled brightly and asked him why he was so completely out of breath. Trent froze in the doorway like a paralyzed animal. His wide eyes darted around the pristine, undisturbed apartment. There were no cops. There were no mobsters. There was absolutely no blood. His entire body shook as the horrifying reality crashed down upon his shoulders. He had given the ruthless cartel her home address, but the professional hitman had simply vanished into thin air. Trent realized in that exact agonizing moment that an invisible, terrifyingly powerful force was actively protecting Naomi. Pure, unadulterated panic consumed his mind. He knew Dominic would demand immediate violent payment now that the intimidation tactic had failed spectacularly. Trent excused himself to the bathroom and locked the heavy wooden door. He stared at his pale, sweating reflection in the mirror. The walls of his lies were closing in fast. He could not wait for the actual wedding day anymore. He had to accelerate the timeline dramatically. He pulled out his phone to call Vanessa. He needed to execute the forgery plan tonight before whoever was watching him decided to strike next. The rain fell in freezing gray sheets against the windshield of my armored SUV. I parked half a block away from a decaying strip mall on the edge of the city limits. I watched Trent Lawson sprint through the puddles holding his expensive leather briefcase over his head to protect his tailored suit. He shoved open the glass door of a dingy storefront. The faded gold lettering on the window read, "Arthur Vance Notary Public." Vance was a disgraced former lawyer who made a quiet living validating fraudulent documents for desperate men. Trent was the most desperate animal in Chicago today. His attempt to intimidate Naomi using cartel muscle had failed spectacularly overnight. He knew his time was up. He needed liquid cash immediately. He planned to secure a predatory loan using the ancestral home of Naomi's late grandmother as collateral. That house represented 4 generations of my wife's family history. Evelyn's mother scrubbed floors for 30 years to pay off that mortgage. Trent intended to steal a century of our legacy with a single stroke of a pen. Inside the SUV, the military-grade audio receiver on my dashboard hummed to life. I listened to the crystal-clear feed from the microphone planted inside Trent's jacket. Trent paced frantically inside the cramped office. He slammed the forged deed onto the cheap laminate desk. He demanded Vance stamp the documents right that second. Vance hesitated, noticing the signature looked remarkably fresh and slightly unsteady. Trent did not waste time arguing. He pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from his pocket and threw it directly into Vance's chest. He ordered the corrupt notary to officially stamp the forgery and file it into the county registry database immediately. The heavy thud of the notary stamp echoed through my speakers like a gunshot. Trent exhaled a massive breath of pure relief. He ordered Vance to expedite the digital filing while he drove straight to his private bank to collect the loan payout. Trent walked back out into the rain, completely unaware that his victory was an absolute illusion. I watched his sports car tear out of the parking lot. I turned off the audio receiver. I stepped out of the vehicle and let the freezing rain wash over my face. It was time to introduce Arthur Vance to the true owner of that estate. The bell above the glass door chimed violently as I pushed my way into the cramped notary office. Arthur Vance did not bother to look up from his desk. He was too busy licking his thumb and counting the thick stack of bribe money Trent had just abandoned. He barked that the office was closed for lunch and told me to come back tomorrow. I did not speak. I walked deliberately across the stained carpet and dropped a heavy red dossier directly on top of his freshly counted cash. The loud slap of the file made him jump out of his chair. He looked up and saw an older African-American man dripping wet in a cheap chauffeur uniform. He sneered and opened his mouth to order me out of his building. I advised him in a dangerously low voice to open the red folder before he made a fatal mistake. Vance scoffed but flipped the heavy cover open. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. The dossier contained 60 pages of undeniable forensic proof documenting every illegal real estate transaction he had rubber-stamped over the past decade. It contained offshore routing numbers, hidden bank accounts, and signed witness affidavits from the vulnerable victims he had systematically defrauded. Oliver Thorne and my legal team had compiled this flawless execution packet in under 2 hours. I told Vance he possessed exactly 2 choices. He could hand over the original forged mortgage documents Trent had just paid him to process, or I would personally hand this red folder to the federal prosecutor before the rain stopped. Vance began to sweat profusely despite the cold draft in the room. He stammered frantically, trying to invent a pathetic excuse about client confidentiality. I leaned over his desk, planting my large hands flat on the wood. I told him he was playing with a property that belonged to my family. He choked on his breath. His hands shook violently as he opened his top desk drawer. He pulled out the thick stack of papers bearing Naomi's forged signature and his own fraudulent notary seal. He pushed them across the desk, pleading with me not to ruin his miserable life. I picked up the forged deed and folded it carefully into my coat pocket. I took the red dossier back. I warned Vance that if he ever mentioned my visit to Trent, I would destroy him so thoroughly he would beg for prison. I turned and walked out of the office, leaving him trembling violently in his chair. Trent stormed into the private wealth management office of his bank, feeling like a conquering king. He sat arrogantly in the leather chair opposite the loan officer. He demanded an immediate $500,000 line of credit utilizing the newly notarized property lien as absolute collateral. He bragged that the digital filing was already in the county system. The loan officer typed frantically on his keyboard. He frowned in complete confusion. He looked at Trent and shook his head. He informed Trent that the county registry had completely rejected the application. The primary title holder had intercepted the filing, confiscated the physical documents, and flagged Trent's name across the banking network for severe mortgage fraud. The loan officer threatened to call building security if Trent did not leave the premises immediately. Trent lost his mind. He fled the bank in a blind, hyperventilating panic. He drove his car recklessly through the midday traffic, entirely consumed by homicidal rage and pure terror. He skidded to a halt outside the strip mall and kicked the glass door of the notary office open. Trent lunged at Arthur Vance like a rabid dog. He pinned the terrified notary against the metal filing cabinets. He grabbed Vance by the collar and screamed directly into his face. He demanded to know who had sabotaged the filing. He accused Vance of stealing the deed to blackmail him for more cash. Vance sobbed uncontrollably, begging for his life. He swore he handed the papers over to a terrifying man who possessed a file full of his darkest secrets. Trent shook him violently, demanding a physical description. Vance choked on his own tears. He described a tall, imposing, older African-American man with a voice like crushed ice. He described a man wearing a dark, cheap chauffeur uniform. He said the man moved with the terrifying authority of a ruthless billionaire. Trent froze completely. His hand slowly released the notary's crumpled shirt. The air vanished from his lungs. The detailed description clicked into place with horrifying precision. The quiet, invisible driver. The man he treated like a piece of worthless furniture. Trent stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The terrifying realization hit him with the blunt force of a wrecking ball. The chauffeur was Naomi's father. The chauffeur was the invisible hand systematically dismantling his entire life piece by piece. I guided the heavy Lincoln down the spiraling concrete ramp into the subterranean parking level. The garage was entirely desolate. Thick concrete pillars cast long shadows under the flickering fluorescent lights. This specific sublevel belonged to a commercial building covertly owned by Rollins Logistics. I parked the vehicle in a designated spot near the freight elevator. I turned off the ignition and allowed the silence to settle around me. I knew exactly who was tailing me. I had watched the frantic headlights of Trent's imported sports car weaving through traffic behind me for the past 4 miles. The trap was perfectly primed. Before I could reach for the door handle, a blinding pair of high beams flooded the dark garage. Trent's vehicle roared down the concrete ramp and skidded violently to a halt. The sports car parked sideways, completely blocking the Lincoln's only exit route. The driver's side door flew open. Trent stepped out into the harsh, artificial light. He was no longer trying to maintain his polished corporate facade. His designer tie was torn loose and his expensive suit jacket hung open. In his right hand, he gripped a solid steel baseball bat. Trent marched toward the Lincoln with pure homicidal intent burning in his eyes. He slammed the heavy steel bat hard against the reinforced hood of my car. The loud metallic crash echoed wildly against the subterranean walls. Trent pointed the weapon directly at my face through the windshield. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding that I step out of the vehicle. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly. I opened the door and stepped out onto the cold concrete floor. I stood tall and faced him without a single trace of fear. Trent closed the distance between us. He leveled the cold steel barrel of the bat against my chest. His breath smelled of stale coffee and absolute panic. He demanded to know exactly who I was. He demanded to know which rival financial firm had hired a miserable old chauffeur to systematically destroy his life. He accused me of confiscating the forged mortgage documents from the notary. He promised to beat me to death right there on the concrete if I did not reveal my employer immediately. I looked at the desperate man standing before me. I maintained absolute silence. My refusal to answer his frantic questions pushed his panicked mind past the breaking point. Trent gripped the handle of the steel bat with both hands. He swung the weapon with vicious, blinding speed. The heavy metal connected directly with my left rib cage. The sickening sound of a cracking bone echoed through the empty parking structure. A massive wave of agonizing pain shot through my entire torso. The sheer physical force of the blow drove the breath from my lungs. I collapsed onto the cold, hard concrete. I fell to my knees, clutching my side. I tasted sharp, metallic copper in the back of my throat. Trent stood over me, breathing heavily. He raised the bat again, ready to deliver another crushing strike to my shoulders. He demanded that I speak. He ordered me to beg for mercy. I refused to grant him that satisfaction. I locked my jaw and stared straight ahead into the gray concrete pillar. I absorbed the excruciating pain in total, absolute silence. I did not raise a hand to defend myself. I did not fight back in any capacity. Every single movement I made was a calculated tactical decision. I knew exactly what Trent did not know. Hidden deep within the concrete pillars and the overhead lighting fixtures were 6 microscopic military-grade cameras. Oliver's shadow security team had installed the recording devices the moment I acquired this specific building. Every brutal swing Trent took was being captured in high-definition video. Every violent threat he screamed was being recorded in crystal-clear audio. This was not a random assault. This was the meticulous documentation of a violent felony. Trent swung the bat a second time. The steel struck my right shoulder, driving me completely to the floor. The cold concrete pressed against my cheek. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. The physical pain was severe, but it was temporary. I willingly traded my own blood to forge the iron chains that would soon wrap around Trent's neck. The security footage of this unprovoked attack would guarantee his permanent incarceration. I remained perfectly still on the ground, letting him believe he had conquered me. I let him revel in his false sense of absolute dominance. Trent dropped the steel bat onto the floor. It clattered loudly against the pavement. He knelt beside my fallen body, completely consumed by his own misguided victory. He grabbed the lapels of my cheap chauffeur jacket and hauled me roughly against the side of the Lincoln. He shoved his hands violently into my interior pockets, searching for any piece of identifying information. He pulled out my worn leather wallet. He sneered at the frayed edges. He flipped it open and extracted my state-issued driver's license. Trent held the small plastic card up to the flickering fluorescent light. He squinted at the text, reading my full legal name out loud. Edgar Rollins. He read the residential address listed on the card. It was the exact address of the rundown suburban house he had visited to demand the wedding funds. The connection slammed into his mind. Trent looked from the small plastic card down to my bleeding face. His eyes widened to an impossible size. He realized the silent, invisible chauffeur was his future father-in-law. He realized the man he had just brutally beaten was Naomi's beloved father. Trent threw his head back and burst into a fit of manic, hysterical laughter. The dark sound bounced violently off the subterranean walls. The sheer terror that had consumed him all morning evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a toxic, overwhelming arrogance. Trent genuinely believed he had just stumbled into the greatest stroke of luck of his miserable life. He looked down at me with pure sadistic joy. He believed he had neutralized the invisible threat. He believed he now possessed the ultimate human leverage over my daughter. Trent grabbed me by the collar and dragged me toward a thick structural pillar. He pulled a thick plastic zip tie from his coat pocket. He secured my hands tightly around the cold concrete column. He leaned in close to my face. He whispered that I had just given him the perfect key to unlock Naomi's entire fortune. He told me he was going to use my battered, bleeding body to force her hand. He stepped back and pulled out his cell phone. The panic was entirely gone. A deadly, high-stakes extortion game had officially commenced. He prepared to dial Naomi's number. He had absolutely no idea he was playing a game he had already lost. The deafening silence of the underground garage shattered instantly. 2 heavily armored black SUVs tore down the spiraling concrete ramp at breakneck speed. The lead vehicle did not even attempt to brake as it approached the heavy steel security gates. It accelerated. The reinforced steel bumper slammed into the barrier with a thunderous metallic crash. The gates buckled and ripped entirely off their iron hinges, scraping violently across the pavement in a shower of brilliant orange sparks. The SUVs skidded into a perfectly synchronized tactical formation, forming a V-shape that effectively sealed off all escape routes for Trent's sports car. 4 doors flew open simultaneously. Oliver's elite shadow security team poured out into the harsh fluorescent light. They moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. There were no shouted warnings and no dramatic demands for surrender. They swept across the cold concrete floor with tactical rifles raised, completely zeroing in on the man standing over my bound body. Trent froze completely. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by sheer, paralyzing terror. He dropped his phone onto the pavement. The digital device clattered loudly next to the discarded steel baseball bat. He realized instantly that these men were not police officers. They were the physical manifestation of the invisible force he had been fighting all morning. Trent spun around, desperately searching for an exit. The main ramp was entirely blocked. The freight elevator doors were sealed shut. His eyes locked onto a small grated maintenance shaft located 10 feet behind the concrete pillar where I was secured. Pure cowardice hijacked his nervous system. Trent abandoned his weapon and his vehicle. He sprinted toward the narrow opening with the clumsy, frantic gait of a hunted animal. He threw his weight against the rusted metal grate, tearing it loose from the wall. He scrambled into the dark, suffocating ductwork, disappearing into the building's subterranean ventilation system just as the first operative reached my position. I watched him crawl away like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. The tactical team immediately secured the perimeter, sweeping the shadows for any secondary threats. I remained perfectly still against the concrete column. My chest burned with every breath, but my mind was utterly calm. The physical assault was over. The complete dismantling of Trent Lawson's existence was about to enter its final catastrophic phase. Oliver Thorne stepped out of the second SUV and strode rapidly across the garage floor. His sharp eyes immediately assessed the brutal aftermath of the assault. He knelt beside the concrete pillar and pulled a combat knife from his tactical vest. With one swift motion, he sliced through the thick plastic zip tie binding my wrists. The sudden rush of blood back into my numb hands sent a wave of stinging needles up to my elbows. I caught my balance against the cold pillar. Oliver offered his arm and hauled me slowly to my feet. He inspected the severe bruising forming across my cheek and the unnatural stiffness of my injured shoulder. His jaw clenched in visible anger. He pulled out his encrypted communication device. He stated firmly that we were calling the authorities immediately. He insisted we had enough high-definition video evidence and recorded audio to lock Trent away for kidnapping and aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. I reached out and clamped my hand firmly over his wrist, forcing him to lower the device. I pulled the dark handkerchief from my pocket and wiped the fresh blood from the corner of my mouth. I looked Oliver directly in the eyes and refused his suggestion. I explained my reasoning with absolute icy clarity. A simple assault charge would be handed over to a slick corporate defense attorney. Trent would leverage his remaining assets to secure a pathetic plea deal. He would serve a fraction of a minimum security sentence and walk free in a few short years to victimize another innocent woman. I demanded a much harsher penalty. I wanted total financial eradication and complete social annihilation. I wanted Trent to experience the exact same paralyzing terror he had inflicted upon my daughter. I wanted him stripped of his fake prestige, his stolen wealth, and his arrogant pride. I wanted him to possess absolutely nothing when the police finally placed him in handcuffs. Oliver stared at me for a long moment, recognizing the unrelenting wrath burning beneath my quiet demeanor. He slowly nodded his head and placed the communication device back into his tactical vest. The parameters of the operation had officially shifted. We were no longer simply protecting Naomi from a predator. We were actively constructing a flawless trap designed to obliterate the predator entirely. I adjusted my torn jacket and walked steadily toward the waiting SUV, ready to initiate the final strike. Trent emerged from the maintenance shaft 3 blocks away, covered in thick dust and blind panic. He flagged down a passing cab and demanded to be taken straight to the luxury arts district. He sprinted through the opulent lobby of Vanessa's apartment complex, ignoring the confused concierge. He hammered his fists against her heavy wooden door until she pulled it open. Trent pushed past her without a single word of explanation. He tore into the bedroom and began ripping clothes from the closet, throwing them haphazardly into a leather duffel bag. Vanessa watched him unravel. She demanded to know what was happening. Trent babbled incoherently about heavily armed men and a massive conspiracy involving Naomi's father. He stated they needed to flee the city immediately before the cartel or the shadow operatives found them. Vanessa possessed a sharp, ruthless survival instinct. She analyzed the frantic, sweating mess of a man tearing apart her bedroom. She recognized a sinking ship instantly. Trent was no longer her golden ticket to early retirement in the Maldives. He was a massive, dangerous liability. She nodded slowly, pretending to agree with his frantic escape plan. She told him she was going to pack her own bags in the guest room. Trent ignored her, completely focused entirely on emptying his wall safe. Vanessa stepped out of the room and closed the door softly behind her. She walked directly to his discarded suit jacket resting on the kitchen counter. She reached into the interior pocket and pulled out his encrypted external hard drive. This small device contained the digital keys to every illegal offshore account and stolen client fund Trent managed. It was his absolute last resort. Vanessa slipped the hard drive into her designer purse. She quietly opened the front door and stepped out into the carpeted hallway, leaving her frantic lover entirely alone. She walked briskly to the elevator. She pulled her phone from her pocket and scrolled through the contacts she had secretly copied from Trent's device weeks ago. She bypassed the mob associates and the corrupt bankers. She located the specific number Trent had labeled under Naomi's father. Vanessa stepped into the empty elevator and initiated the call. She listened to the dial tone echoing in her ear. She was a mercenary cutting her losses, and she was fully prepared to sell Trent Lawson to the highest bidder to guarantee her own survival. I dialed Oliver's encrypted line back. I did not raise my voice. I did not show my panic. I gave him a single absolute command: execute the shadow protocol. Oliver did not question me. He knew the protocol. He knew the stakes. 30 years ago, when I built Rollins Logistics into a global empire, I did not just buy warehouses and shipping fleets. I bought institutions. I purchased a controlling interest in First Fidelity Trust. I was a ghost in their system. I was the silent, anonymous majority shareholder. Trent Lawson believed he was clever by forcing Naomi to deposit her life savings into a pristine elite banking institution. He had absolutely no idea he was placing her money directly into my personal vault. I instructed Oliver to bypass the branch managers. I instructed him to bypass the regional directors. I told him to go straight to the internal security director of the bank. We flagged Trent's specific joint account routing number for high-level suspicious activity. We flagged it for suspected money laundering. We flagged it for international wire fraud. Oliver initiated a Level 5 internal fraud investigation. Within exactly 60 seconds, the massive joint account was completely and utterly paralyzed. The digital vault slammed shut. The trap was locked. The money was locked. The future Trent thought he had stolen was locked. Trent could stare at the numbers on his screen, but he could not touch a single penny. He could not withdraw the funds. He could not transfer the funds. He could not close the account. Naomi's entire life savings were effectively trapped in a digital purgatory. Her money was frozen. Her money was unreachable. Her money was finally safe. I ended the call with Oliver and stared out the windshield at the slick city streets. I had severed Trent's primary financial lifeline. I had cut the cord. He was a cornered rat facing dangerous predators, and I had just welded his only escape hatch shut. I put the car in gear. I drove away from this coffee shop knowing the monster was about to experience a catastrophic meltdown. I drove straight to my private penthouse office overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline. The room was submerged in heavy shadows. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I did not want to see my own reflection. I walked toward the massive mahogany desk and gripped the edge as a sudden vicious pain tore through my chest. The pain radiated down my left arm. The pain settled deep in my ribs like a jagged piece of glass. The pain was a relentless reminder of my own mortality. I pulled open the top drawer and retrieved a small amber prescription bottle. My hands shook violently. My hands, usually as steady as polished steel, trembled as I spilled 2 white pills onto the wood surface. I swallowed them dry. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing into a slow, measured rhythm. The physical toll of this covert war was rapidly catching up to my aging body. My cardiologist had warned me last month. He warned me that my heart was operating on borrowed time. He warned me that I needed immediate surgery and absolute rest. Rest was a luxury I could not afford. Rest was a surrender I would not accept. The agonizing stress of watching Naomi willingly walk into a predator's trap was killing me faster than any medical condition. Every time Trent looked at my daughter with his fake, charming smile, my blood pressure spiked. Every time Naomi aggressively defended him, my heart fractured. Every single lie he told her was a physical blow to my chest. I refused to collapse. I refused to let my body fail before my mission was complete. I poured a glass of cold water and drank it down, waiting for the strong medication to force my heart rate back to a normal tempo. I looked at the framed photograph of Evelyn on my desk. I promised her I would keep our daughter safe. I promised her I would protect Naomi from the exact kind of monster Trent Lawson proved to be. A hospital bed would only render me useless. I could not fight a brutal war from a sterile recovery room. I smoothed the wrinkles from my cheap chauffeur uniform. I was not a sick old man. I was a father defending his blood. I had a war to finish. Miles away in his glass-walled corporate office, Trent stared at his computer monitor in absolute disbelief. Hidden cameras in the building's network accessed by Oliver's security team broadcasted Trent's meltdown directly to my secure tablet. Trent furiously clicked his mouse, desperately trying to authorize the wire transfer to the cartel. The screen repeatedly flashed a stark red error message indicating the account was frozen pending a severe fraud investigation. He slammed his fists against the keyboard. The panic in his eyes morphed into blind, unhinged rage. He picked up his expensive silver laptop and hurled it across the room. The machine shattered against the tempered glass wall, raining plastic and metal components onto the carpet. His lifeline was gone. His escape was gone. His future was gone. His cell phone rang immediately. It was Dominic. I listened to the intercepted audio feed as Trent answered with a weak, trembling voice. He begged for just 3 more days. He begged for mercy. He cried, offering pathetic excuses about banking errors and bureaucratic delays. Dominic did not care about bank errors. The loan shark's voice was a low, terrifying growl. Dominic stated that patience was a commodity Trent could no longer afford. The mobster delivered a chilling ultimatum. He promised to send his men to find Naomi. He explicitly threatened to cut off Naomi's ring finger. He threatened to mail that finger to Trent in a small box if the $500,000 debt was not settled in exactly 72 hours. Trent gasped for air. He was a pathetic coward stripped of all his arrogant armor. He was a cornered animal willing to chew off his own leg to survive. Instead of protecting his future wife, Trent made the ultimate unforgivable choice. He made the choice of a true predator. To buy himself a miserable 3-day extension, Trent gave the mobster Naomi's exact home address. He gave them the security gate code to her building. He offered my daughter as collateral to violent killers just to save his own skin. The audio feed cut out. The line went dead. Naomi was no longer just dealing with a fraudulent fiancé. She was now a direct physical target for ruthless criminals. The heavy wooden door of Naomi's apartment splintered inward with a deafening crack. The deadbolt tore completely through the doorframe, raining wood shards onto the entryway runner. Naomi dropped her phone and spun around. Trent stood in the threshold, breathing like a cornered beast. The polished charm was completely gone. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, reflecting pure, desperate madness. He stepped into the apartment and kicked the broken door shut behind him. In his right hand, he held a thick white cloth soaked in a harsh chemical solvent. The pungent, sickening smell of chloroform instantly filled the small hallway. Naomi did not freeze. The survival instinct inherited from her father kicked in immediately. She lunged backward toward the kitchen counter and grabbed a heavy ceramic vase. Trent charged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He swung his left arm wildly, trying to pin her against the drywall. Naomi ducked under his grasp and swung the ceramic vase with all her might. The heavy base connected directly with the side of Trent's skull. The vase shattered into a dozen jagged pieces, scattering across the hardwood floor. A thick line of crimson blood instantly welled up along Trent's hairline. The blow staggered him, but the adrenaline and pure terror flooding his system kept him on his feet. He let out a primal, furious roar and tackled her to the ground. They crashed onto the living room rug. Naomi fought with absolute ferocity. She clawed at his face. She kicked his shins. She fought to break his center of gravity. Trent ignored the pain. He possessed the desperate physical strength of a man facing a lengthy prison sentence. He pinned her arms to the floor with his knees and pressed the soaked chemical rag violently over her nose and mouth. Naomi thrashed wildly. She held her breath until her lungs burned with agonizing heat. She held her breath until the room began to spin. She held her breath until the toxic fumes forced their way into her system. Her vision blurred at the edges. The violent struggling slowly drained from her limbs. The world faded into a heavy, suffocating blackness. Trent waited until her body went completely limp. He hauled her unconscious form over his bleeding shoulder. He carried her down the back emergency stairs and dumped her roughly into the passenger seat of his vehicle. The deafening roar of the sports car engine and the rhythmic slashing of the windshield wipers pulled Naomi back into consciousness. A brutal, throbbing headache pounded behind her eyes. Her mouth tasted of bitter, toxic chemicals. She tried to lift her hands to rub her temples, but a sharp pain sliced into her wrists. Thick industrial zip ties bound her arms tightly to the interior door handle. She blinked rapidly, clearing the chemical fog from her vision. The world outside the window was a blur of black asphalt and freezing rain. They were tearing down a desolate stretch of the interstate miles beyond the city limits. Trent gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. The blood from the vase strike had dried in a dark streak across the side of his face. He noticed her moving and immediately erupted into a volcanic rage. He did not look at her with an ounce of human empathy. He unleashed a torrent of venomous, vile hatred. The mask of the progressive, supportive fiancé disintegrated completely. He screamed that she was a pathetic stepping stone. He screamed that she was a walking payday. He screamed that she was nothing more than collateral meant to clear his ledger. He unleashed a barrage of deeply racist and misogynistic insults that he had clearly buried beneath his polished corporate exterior for years. He told her he absolutely loathed everything about her family. He mocked her intelligence and her blind devotion. He blamed her for the total collapse of his perfect extortion plan. He told her she was going to sign the marriage certificate across the state line tonight, or he would drive the car into a concrete embankment and end them both. Every word he spat was laced with pure, toxic entitlement. Naomi sat trapped in the freezing leather seat, absorbing the horrifying reality of the monster she had almost married. The charm had been a weapon. The love had been a financial calculation. She did not cry. The initial shock hardened into absolute, icy clarity. She stared straight ahead at the rain-slicked road, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her tears. She silently prayed that her father had understood the childhood hand signal. The sports car accelerated violently, reaching speeds well over 90 miles per hour. The heavy freezing rain reduced visibility to a few fleeting yards. Trent drove with suicidal recklessness. He cursed the violent weather and pounded his bleeding fist against the leather dashboard. A sudden blinding wall of halogen light erupted through the dark downpour directly ahead of them. Trent slammed both feet onto the brake pedal with all his remaining strength. The high-performance tires locked and screamed against the wet asphalt. The vehicle hydroplaned wildly, fishtailing across 3 lanes of empty highway in a terrifying spin. The sports car jerked to a violent halt just inches away from a massive wall of reinforced steel. 3 colossal commercial semi-trucks completely blocked the entire width of the interstate. The massive trailers stood shoulder to shoulder, creating an impenetrable fortress of heavy industrial machinery. Painted vividly across the side of the towering trailers was the unmistakable corporate logo of Rollins Logistics Worldwide. Trent stared at the mechanical blockade in absolute paralyzing shock. The engine of his sports car stalled and died, leaving only the sound of the torrential rain hammering against the metal roof. The air brakes of the massive trucks hissed loudly into the freezing night. The driver's side door of the center semi-truck swung open with a heavy metallic clank. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped down from the high cab and planted his heavy boots firmly onto the wet pavement. Edgar Rollins walked slowly into the harsh, blinding glow of the headlights. He wore his dark chauffeur jacket completely soaked by the freezing rain. He did not carry a steel baseball bat. He did not carry a clipboard full of legal documents. He did not carry a single ounce of mercy. In his right hand he held a matte black military-grade 9mm pistol. He raised the weapon smoothly and racked the heavy steel slide, chambering a live round with a sharp, deadly click. The metallic sound cut cleanly through the howling storm. He pointed the barrel directly through the rain-slicked windshield, aiming straight for the center of Trent's forehead. The father had finally arrived to collect the debt. The ultimate predator had cornered his prey in the darkness. The metallic click of the chambered round shattered Trent's last remaining delusion. He realized he was not facing a broken chauffeur, but a ruthless executioner. Pure animal panic seized his nervous system. He reached across the center console and violently grabbed Naomi's bound arms. He hauled her across the gear shift and dragged her out the driver's side door into the freezing downpour. Naomi stumbled against the slick asphalt, but Trent yanked her upright. He pressed his spine against the side of the sports car, using my daughter as a human shield. From his ruined suit jacket, he pulled a serrated tactical knife. He pressed the cold steel edge directly against the pulsing vein in Naomi's throat. The freezing rain plastered her dark hair against her face. She blinked rapidly against the deluge, but she did not scream. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. The thick plastic zip ties binding her wrists cut deeply into her skin. Trent screamed into the roaring storm. He ordered me to drop the weapon. His voice cracked with absolute hysteria. He threatened to slice her throat open right there on the highway. He pressed the blade harder until a thin line of crimson appeared on her pale skin, mingling with the heavy rain. He declared that he had absolutely nothing left to lose. I stood perfectly still. The torrential downpour washed the dried blood from my bruised cheek and my swollen jaw. The freezing water ran down the barrel of my pistol. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I kept the 9mm weapon aimed squarely at his right eye. I was calculating the wind speed. I was measuring the distance. I was weighing the precise risk of a headshot against the erratic shaking of his panicked hands. A panicked man holding a blade was entirely unpredictable. I needed to shift his focus from his own survival to his ultimate weakness. I needed to leverage the very greed that had driven him to this miserable dead end. I slowly lowered the barrel of the pistol toward the wet asphalt. I maintained unbroken eye contact with the desperate coward hiding behind my only child. I opened my grip and let the heavy pistol fall. The weapon splashed into a deep puddle at my boots. Trent let out a breathless, jagged laugh, believing he had won the psychological standoff. I turned my back to him for a fraction of a second. I reached into the elevated cab of the semi-truck and grabbed the heavy black canvas duffel bag resting on the passenger seat. I turned back around and hauled the bag into the driving rain. I threw it down onto the wet pavement between us. The heavy canvas hit the ground with a dull thud, splashing dirty water against Trent's expensive leather shoes. I knelt slowly and grasped the heavy brass zipper. I pulled it open completely, exposing the contents to the harsh glare of the halogen headlights. Packed tightly inside were neatly banded stacks of untraceable $100 bills. $2 million in raw liquid cash sat rapidly absorbing the freezing rain. I stood up and kicked the bag forward. It slid across the slick asphalt and bumped against the front tire of his sports car perfectly within his line of sight. I spoke for the first time since the subterranean garage. My voice cut through the howling storm with absolute steady authority. I told him the money was his. I told him it was more than enough to pay off the Chicago syndicate and secure a comfortable, anonymous life anywhere in the world. I told him all he had to do was lower the blade, release my daughter, and walk away. Trent stared at the massive fortune. His chest heaved erratically. The torrential rain battered the exposed currency, but the green stacks remained undeniably real. The absolute desperation that had fueled his violence collided violently with his insatiable, endless greed. He had spent months orchestrating a complex extortion scheme to steal a fraction of this amount. Now a vastly superior fortune sat right at his feet, requiring absolutely no effort to acquire. His survival instinct faltered. His intense focus on Naomi fractured. He physically leaned forward to get a better look at the cash. His right hand gripping the serrated knife drifted a crucial 2 inches away from Naomi's throat. He made the fatal tactical error of taking his eyes off his hostage to look at the money. Naomi recognized the microscopic shift in his grip. The fierce survival instinct I had spent her entire childhood cultivating ignited perfectly. She did not hesitate. She dropped her center of gravity and drove her sharp elbow backward with vicious, brutal force. The bone connected solidly with Trent's lower ribs. He gasped in sudden, agonizing pain. His grip loosened entirely. Naomi tore herself away from his grasp and sprinted toward me, slipping wildly on the wet asphalt. Trent roared in anger and lunged forward to grab her. He never took a second step. 4 figures clad in black tactical gear materialized from the deep shadows behind the towering semi-trucks. Oliver's shadow operatives hit Trent with the synchronized force of a freight train. They tackled him violently to the ground, pinning him face down against the freezing pavement. The tactical knife clattered uselessly into the darkness. A heavy combat boot slammed onto Trent's wrist, neutralizing any further threat. Naomi crashed into my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight against the freezing rain. She was shaking violently, but she was completely safe. I pulled her back and inspected the shallow cut on her neck. It was a superficial scratch. The relief that washed over me was absolute. Naomi turned her head and looked at the brutal scene unfolding on the highway. She watched elite paramilitary operatives secure the man she had almost married. She looked at the 3 massive commercial trucks forming an impenetrable steel wall across the interstate. The bright Rollins Logistics Worldwide logos gleamed under the streetlights. She looked at the abandoned duffel bag overflowing with $2 million in cash lying in a puddle. She looked back at my battered face. The cheap chauffeur uniform I wore no longer disguised the ruthless, calculated power orchestrating this entire military operation. The lifelong illusion of the humble, broken father evaporated into the stormy night. Her breathing slowed. The terror in her eyes was rapidly replaced by profound, staggering confusion. She stepped out of my embrace entirely. She pointed at the armed men and the massive logistics trucks. She demanded to know what was happening. She demanded to know exactly who I really was. I guided the armored SUV away from the rain-slicked highway, leaving the chaotic crime scene behind. The drive was completely silent. The heavy rain beat relentlessly against the reinforced glass. Naomi stared at the man she thought she knew. She stared at the father she thought she had protected. She stared at the stranger commanding the vehicle. We glided through the slick, desolate streets. We bypassed the modest suburban neighborhoods. We entered the towering steel and glass heart of the financial district. The vehicle descended into a brightly lit, immaculate subterranean parking facility, a private, secure facility bearing the Rollins Logistics insignia. I guided her toward a set of polished steel elevator doors. I did not speak. I did not offer empty comfort. I pressed my palm against a biometric scanner. The heavy steel doors parted silently. The elevator car shot upward with stomach-dropping speed. It bypassed the corporate floors. It bypassed the executive suites. It bypassed everything Trent Lawson had ever aspired to touch. The doors opened directly into the penthouse. The entire floor was a monument to invisible, unyielding power. Rich mahogany paneling lined the walls. Thick, soundproof carpets absorbed our heavy footsteps. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a staggering, unobstructed panoramic view of the entire Chicago skyline. Naomi walked slowly toward the freezing glass. The sprawling city lights glittered through the relentless storm. She looked at the glittering towers. She looked at the corporate empires. She looked at the vast kingdom I had quietly conquered. She had spent her entire life believing I was a fragile, aging chauffeur who needed her protection. She had spent her entire life defending me from the arrogance of men like Trent. The truth slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. I did not need protection. I was the protection. I was the silent architect of this massive global empire. The cheap uniform was a ghost. The run-down suburban house was a ghost. The fragile old man was a ghost. The entire illusion was a carefully constructed ghost. I stood behind her, reflecting perfectly in the wet, dark glass. I stood tall, silent, and completely unyielding. The storm outside raged violently against the building. The storm inside the penthouse was an absolute, terrifying silence. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk anchoring the center of the room. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the stolen, encrypted hard drive onto the polished wood. I placed the high-resolution photographs of Trent and Vanessa entering the luxury hotel. I placed the digital audio recorder containing every vile threat and desperate mob negotiation Trent had ever uttered. I laid out the absolute, undeniable proof of his betrayal. Naomi turned away from the window and approached the desk. She picked up the photographs. Her hands trembled slightly as the image of her fiancé kissing another woman burned into her mind. She touched the cold metal of the hard drive containing the stolen client funds. I spoke to her with absolute gentle honesty. I told her about the vow I made to her mother. I promised Evelyn on her deathbed that I would protect our daughter from the vultures of this world. I promised her I would never let our wealth become a target for greedy, soulless predators. I explained why I hid the empire. I explained why I raised her in humble simplicity. I explained exactly why I tested Trent Lawson. I needed to see the man hiding beneath the tailored suits and the charming, rehearsed smiles. I needed to see what he would do when faced with a useless, penniless father-in-law. Trent had failed every single test. Trent had proven himself to be a parasite willing to destroy her life for a paycheck. Naomi listened to my confession in absolute silence. She absorbed every brutal detail of Trent's deception. She absorbed the magnitude of his violent betrayal. Her heart shattered. Her heart shattered for the future she thought she was building. Her heart shattered for the man she thought she loved. Her heart shattered completely into 1,000 jagged pieces. I watched the devastating grief wash over her pale face. I watched the tears well up in her eyes. But the tears did not fall. The profound, agonizing grief suddenly stopped. The terrible shattering paused. The fragmented pieces of her heart began to fuse back together. They fused under the intense, crushing pressure of pure, absolute rage. The innocent, trusting woman died in that penthouse. Her heart hardened into cold, unforgiving steel. She placed the photographs back onto the mahogany desk. She traced her finger over Trent's smiling face. She was no longer a victim, she was a Rollins. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse swung open. Oliver Thorne stepped into the room. His tactical gear was still dripping wet from the highway confrontation. He stood at attention and addressed me directly. He reported that Trent was securely detained in the lower holding facility. Oliver asked for the final directive. He asked if he should call the authorities and hand over the hard drive, the recordings, and the kidnapping charges. He asked if we were finally terminating the threat. Naomi did not look at me. Naomi did not hesitate. She stood up perfectly straight. She wiped a single stray drop of rainwater from her cheek. She turned to Oliver and issued her very first command as the heir to the Rollins empire. She refused the police. She refused the quick legal resolution. She refused to let Trent Lawson hide his cowardice behind the sterile walls of a courtroom. She demanded a much grander stage for his destruction. She wanted Trent to believe he had actually won. She wanted him to believe the violent highway extortion had succeeded perfectly. She wanted him to walk into that extravagant wedding venue overflowing with his arrogant family and his high society friends. She wanted him to stand at the altar completely convinced he had finally secured his ultimate golden ticket to unimaginable wealth and limitless power. She wanted to execute him publicly. She wanted to dismantle his life piece by piece in front of every single person he had ever tried to impress. She wanted his mother, his colleagues, and his mistresses to witness his total, absolute annihilation. She wanted them to see the monster hiding behind the tailored suit. I looked at my daughter standing tall in the shadows of the penthouse. The brilliant Chicago skyline framed her silhouette. I saw the exact same ruthless, unyielding fire that had driven me to conquer the logistics industry. I saw my own blood burning brightly within her veins. I nodded slowly to Oliver, confirming her absolute authority. The tactical commander bowed his head and exited the room, leaving the two of us alone to forge our vengeance. The extortion game was over. The wedding game had officially commenced. Father and daughter stood shoulder to shoulder in the quiet penthouse. We began to design the ultimate inescapable public trap. Naomi sat at the heavy mahogany desk and pulled the secure satellite phone toward her. The sleek black device was completely untraceable, routing the signal through 3 distinct international servers before reaching its destination. She took a deep, measured breath and closed her eyes. I watched the cold, hardened steel in her expression instantly vanish. She meticulously constructed the facade of a broken, terrified victim. She let out a ragged, convincing sob and dialed Trent's personal cell phone. He answered on the first ring. His voice was a frantic, desperate bark demanding to know who was calling. Naomi let out a sharp, manufactured gasp. She cried his name with perfect, calculated fragility. She told him she had managed to break free from the armed men when their truck slowed down at a dark intersection. She lied with absolute, flawless conviction. She claimed she was currently hiding behind a dumpster in a freezing industrial park. Trent's tone shifted immediately. The violent, unhinged monster I had faced on the highway evaporated. He reinstated the smooth, comforting persona of the protective fiancé. He demanded to know her exact location. He promised to come save her. Naomi refused. She injected pure panic into her voice, stating that the men were still searching the streets for her. She told him she was too terrified to go back to her apartment. She told him the only place she would feel entirely safe was standing next to him at the altar. She begged him to keep their wedding schedule exactly as planned for the following afternoon. She promised to find a safe route to the chapel and meet him there. Trent calculated the situation in total silence for a fraction of a second. His insatiable greed violently overrode any remaining logical caution. He knew that the moment they exchanged vows, he would gain immediate legal access to her grandmother's estate. A marriage certificate was his absolute final lifeline. He agreed instantly. He poured fake honey into his voice, promising to protect her forever. He told her he loved her more than life itself. Naomi maintained her terrified persona until she severed the connection. She placed the satellite phone back onto the desk. The frightened victim disappeared entirely. A dark, ruthlessly triumphant smile crossed her face. The bait was set and the predator had swallowed the hook whole. I left Naomi in the secure penthouse and descended to the subterranean garage. Oliver Thorne waited by the armored SUV with a heavy titanium briefcase. We drove to a dimly lit meatpacking warehouse on the industrial south side of Chicago. The massive steel doors rolled open, revealing Dominic and 4 heavily armed associates waiting in the shadows. The loan shark looked at my cheap chauffeur uniform with open disdain. He demanded to know why a miserable driver was wasting his valuable time. I did not offer introductions. I did not negotiate. I signaled Oliver. He stepped forward and placed the titanium briefcase onto a rusted metal barrel. He snapped the latches open, revealing $2 million in sequentially numbered untraceable bills. Dominic's arrogant sneer vanished instantly. I spoke with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who owned the very ground he stood upon. I stated I was purchasing Trent Lawson's entire debt. I was paying double the principal in exchange for the original physical promissory notes. Dominic understood raw power when it stared him in the face. He signaled his lieutenant, who handed over the bloody ledger. I was now Trent's sole legal and physical creditor. I owned his life. We left the warehouse and executed the second phase of the preparation. Oliver drove us to a secure federal building downtown. We bypassed the standard security checkpoints and entered the private office of the lead director of the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. The director was a man I had quietly funded through various anonymous political action committees for a decade. I placed Trent's encrypted hard drive onto his desk. I provided the decryption keys we had extracted. I handed over the undeniable digital proof of massive corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and the systematic theft of millions in client funds. The federal agents immediately initiated a massive multi-agency takedown protocol. They mobilized forensic accounting teams and tactical strike units. They froze every single legitimate corporate account tied to Trent's financial firm. I had systematically severed every escape route. Trent was breathing air in a cage he could not even see. The legal and financial traps were perfectly primed. The following afternoon, the Gothic architecture of the historic downtown chapel cast long, dramatic shadows across the marble floors. The massive vaulted ceilings echoed with the soft, traditional music of a string quartet. The brilliant stained glass windows bathed the wooden pews in a warm, forgiving light. Trent Lawson stood at the altar. He wore a flawless, tailored tuxedo. His hair was perfectly styled, completely hiding the bruising and the cut on his scalp. He projected an aura of absolute, untouchable confidence. He smiled his perfect, rehearsed, fake smile at the arriving guests. The right side of the aisle was packed with his arrogant family members, his sneering corporate colleagues, and his high society friends. They whispered amongst themselves, boasting about their wealth and judging the floral arrangements. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting in a slaughterhouse. Trent looked toward the left side of the aisle, expecting to see Naomi's distant relatives and modest friends. He expected a collection of easy victims. Instead, the bride's side of the chapel was a chilling display of silent, lethal power. The wooden pews were filled with broad-shouldered men wearing sharp, dark suits. They did not smile. They did not whisper. They sat with rigid military posture. Dominic and his entire crew of violent enforcers occupied the third row, staring holes through Trent's skull. Behind them sat rows of undercover federal agents and elite forensic accountants from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Mixed among the federal authorities were Oliver's most ruthless shadow operatives. The left side of the room was a concentrated physical manifestation of Trent's imminent destruction. Trent stood at the altar, completely oblivious to the identities of the men watching him. His blinding arrogance shielded him from reality. He believed they were simply distant cousins or irrelevant business associates from my side of the family. He straightened his silk tie and clasped his hands in front of him, entirely convinced he had won the extortion game. He believed he was seconds away from securing Naomi's fortune and erasing his deadly debts. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel slammed shut with a deafening, echoing boom. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the packed room. The execution sequence was initiated. The massive oak doors at the back of the chapel swung outward with a deep, resonant groan. The delicate string quartet instantly ceased their playing. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the vaulted room for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the towering pipe organ high above the choir loft unleashed a thunderous, commanding march. The deep bass notes vibrated heavily through the marble floorboards and rattled the ancient stained glass windows. I stepped over the threshold into the blinding light of the sanctuary. I did not wear the frayed polyester uniform of a suburban chauffeur. I wore an immaculate midnight black bespoke tuxedo tailored from Super 150s Italian wool. A crisp silk bow tie sat perfectly against my collar. A platinum watch gleamed sharply on my left wrist. I offered my right arm. Naomi stepped forward and hooked her hand firmly through the crook of my elbow. She was a vision of absolute lethal grace. Her white silk gown trailed elegantly across the polished stone. Her face was a masterclass in composure. She radiated the terrifying, unyielding strength of a true corporate heir. We began our slow, deliberate march down the long center aisle. The right side of the chapel was packed with Trent's elite guests. They turned in their wooden pews expecting to see a naive girl and a broken old man. Instead, they witnessed an imposing display of absolute power. Whispers rippled through the high society crowd like a sudden winter wind. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the altar. Trent stood waiting by the steps. His perfect rehearsed smile was frozen in place. He watched us approach. His eyes darted to my tailored suit. He looked at my bruised face, which now carried the hardened geometry of an industry titan rather than the submissive slump of a victim. Trent's flawless facade cracked. His pristine smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A micro-expression of sheer primal confusion flashed across his features. The narrative he had meticulously constructed was actively unraveling right in front of his eyes. He looked past us toward the bride's side of the aisle, hoping to find reassurance in a crowd of easy victims. He found only the stone-faced federal agents and the silent, heavily armed mob enforcers staring back at him. The temperature in the chapel seemed to plummet. We closed the remaining distance with the rhythmic precision of a firing squad. We reached the final step before the altar. The towering marble structure felt cold and permanent under the massive domed ceiling. Trent stepped down to meet us. He recovered his composure with desperate, frantic speed. He plastered the fake, charming smile back onto his face and extended his manicured right hand toward Naomi. It was the traditional gesture of a groom accepting his bride from a willing father. I did not step back. I did not release my daughter's arm. I ignored his outstretched hand entirely. I stepped forward, planting my polished leather shoes firmly between Trent and Naomi. I created a solid physical barricade of pure wool and muscle. Trent's extended hand hovered uselessly in the empty air. His smile tightened into a rigid, furious grimace. He leaned forward and whispered through gritted teeth, demanding to know what I was doing. He ordered me to step aside and complete the handover before he caused a scene. He still believed he held the absolute leverage. He still believed the forged mortgage documents and the cartel threats guaranteed my total submission. I looked down at him with the cold, detached curiosity of a man observing an insect. I did not utter a single word in response. I simply rotated my shoulders and turned my back to him. I faced the bewildered priest standing behind the heavy wooden pulpit. The elderly clergyman shifted uncomfortably in his ornate vestments. He looked from Trent's sweating face to my unyielding posture. The tension in the chapel thickened into a suffocating atmospheric pressure. The whispered conversations from the groom's side abruptly ceased. The entire congregation held its collective breath. Trent's mother half rose from the front pew, clutching her pearl necklace in total confusion. Trent tugged aggressively at his collar. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He was entirely trapped between his expectant high society peers and a terrifying wall of unknown enforcers. He realized he had lost complete control of the ceremony. He realized the man standing before him was not a pawn to be sacrificed. I stood immovable, holding the line. I waited for the exact procedural moment to detonate the explosive charges we had planted directly beneath his life. The elderly priest cleared his throat nervously, attempting to salvage the sacred ceremony. He opened his leather-bound book and began to read the traditional vows. His voice echoed thinly through the massive vaulted ceiling. He rushed through the opening remarks, eager to move past the profound awkwardness choking the altar. He reached the pivotal canonical question. He asked the congregation if anyone present possessed a just and lawful reason why these two individuals should not be joined in holy matrimony. He paused, expecting the standard uninterrupted silence. I did not wait for the silence to settle. I turned slowly away from the altar and faced the packed congregation. I projected my voice with the booming, resonant authority of a man who commanded thousands. I stated clearly and absolutely that I objected. A collective shocked gasp erupted from the right side of the chapel. Trent lunged forward, his face contorted in blind animal panic. He reached out to grab my shoulder, attempting to physically silence me. He never made contact. Before Trent could utter a single desperate excuse, the chapel's massive acoustic sound system roared to life. Oliver's shadow operatives had completely hijacked the audio network. The delicate string quartet music was instantly replaced by crystal-clear digital audio. The recording of Trent and Vanessa in the hotel parking lot blasted through the nave with deafening volume. Trent's own arrogant voice echoed off the stained glass windows. He bragged loudly about the fake legal contracts. He bragged about his foolproof plan to steal Naomi's entire fortune. Vanessa's sweet mocking laughter filled the church. She called me a wretched old hag. Trent promised her they would throw me out of the house the moment the ink dried on the marriage certificate. The horrifying, undeniable truth of his predator nature washed over the entire congregation. Trent's mother collapsed back into her pew, covering her mouth in sheer absolute horror. The wealthy corporate executives stared at the altar in deep disgust. Trent stood completely frozen under the crushing weight of his exposed sins. His entire fabricated life shattered into dust. The trap had sprung with flawless, devastating precision. The public annihilation of Trent Lawson was now fully in motion. The sharp, mocking laughter of the mistress bounced off the ancient stone pillars and reverberated through the vaulted ceiling. Every vile word Trent had spoken in the shadows was now amplified and broadcast to his entire world. The polished facade of the high society congregation completely shattered. A collective gasp of sheer disbelief rippled through the wooden pews on the right side of the aisle. Trent's mother stood up abruptly, her face drained of all color as she stared at her son in absolute horror. She dropped her expensive silk clutch, spilling its contents onto the marble floor. His father gripped the back of the wooden pew with white knuckles, entirely paralyzed by the devastating public humiliation. The distinguished corporate executives and wealthy investors shifted uncomfortably, realizing they were inextricably linked to a colossal fraud. Trent stood at the altar, breathing in ragged, frantic gasps. His perfectly styled hair fell into his wild, terrified eyes. The inescapable reality of his total destruction finally severed his last remaining thread of sanity. He let out a visceral, guttural roar of pure animalistic rage. He lunged forward off the altar platform, aiming directly for my throat. He intended to physically tear me down to regain some microscopic fraction of control. He did not even make it 2 steps. 2 broad-shouldered men sitting in the front row on the bride's side moved with terrifying synchronized speed. The undercover federal agents stepped smoothly out of the wooden pews, intersecting Trent's violent trajectory. They did not hesitate. The agent on the left grabbed Trent's extended arm and twisted it sharply behind his back, applying brutal, calculated leverage. The agent on the right swept Trent's legs out from under him. Trent crashed face first onto the unforgiving marble floor with a sickening hollow thud. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. His expensive tailored tuxedo jacket tore at the shoulder seam as the agents pinned him down. A heavy knee pressed firmly into the center of his spine, trapping him against the cold stone. Trent thrashed wildly like a cornered, desperate predator. He spat blood onto the pristine white aisle runner. He screamed that the audio was a fabricated lie. He screamed that I was a criminal trying to frame him. He screamed because screaming was the only weapon he had left. His frantic denials echoed pathetically against the towering stained glass windows. I stood perfectly still next to Naomi, looking down at the broken man writhing at my feet. The chaos in the chapel swelled into a deafening crescendo, but the true execution had only just begun. The heavy oak door leading to the sacristy slowly clicked open, cutting through the frantic murmurs of the stunned congregation. Vanessa stepped out of the shadows and walked deliberately toward the center of the altar. The collective attention of the chapel shifted instantly to the woman whose voice had just echoed through the sound system. She did not wear the confident, arrogant smirk from the audio recording. She wore the physical evidence of Trent's violent desperation. A deep purple bruise covered the entire left side of her jaw. Her lower lip was split and swollen. Trent had brutally beaten her the previous night when he discovered the encrypted hard drive was missing. He had blamed her for the catastrophic security breach. That violent, cowardly act had permanently severed her loyalty. She walked down the marble steps with her head held high, completely ignoring the horrified stares of Trent's family. She bypassed the thrashing groom pinned to the floor without offering him a single glance. She stopped directly in front of the lead federal agent coordinating the strike team. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. She handed the official signed affidavits directly to the authorities. The documents contained a meticulous chronological record of Trent's massive embezzlement network. They contained the sworn testimonies detailing the offshore shell companies. They contained the falsified routing numbers. They contained the fake corporate profiles he had used to drain millions from his elite clients. Vanessa provided the final, undeniable nail in his coffin in exchange for complete federal immunity. Trent twisted his neck painfully against the marble floor to look at her. The sight of his accomplice handing over the ultimate proof of his guilt drained the remaining fight from his muscles. His frantic thrashing ceased entirely. He stared at Vanessa with wide, bloodshot eyes, silently begging her to retract the evidence. He stared at her, hoping for a fraction of the loyalty he had destroyed. He mouthed desperate, pathetic pleas for mercy. He mouthed promises he could never keep. He mouthed words that meant absolutely nothing. Vanessa simply looked down at him with cold, absolute disgust. She turned away and walked calmly down the center aisle, leaving him to face the devastating consequences of his own insatiable greed. The towering house of cards Trent had spent years meticulously building collapsed completely into dust. The undeniable truth of his crimes was now fully documented, verified, and in the hands of the federal government. The illusion of the brilliant, successful financier was dead. Only the pathetic reality of a violent common thief remained. The lead federal agent secured the manila folders and signaled the tactical team. 2 agents hauled Trent violently to his feet. His legs barely supported his own weight. The pristine white collar of his tuxedo shirt was smeared with his own blood. The lead agent stepped forward and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He clamped the cold metal brutally tight around Trent's wrists, locking his arms securely behind his back. The sharp ratcheting sound of the handcuffs echoed sharply over the stunned murmurs of the high society crowd. The agent read Trent his Miranda rights with a loud, booming authority that easily overpowered the frantic whispering in the pews. He listed the federal charges one by one, driving each offense into the quiet chapel like a physical strike. He announced the charges of massive international wire fraud. He announced the charges of corporate embezzlement and aggravated forgery. He announced the federal indictment for attempted kidnapping and violent extortion. Every single crime carried a severe, mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Trent's knees buckled. The sheer, insurmountable weight of his immediate future crushed his remaining delusions. He began to weep. Genuine, pathetic tears streamed down his bruised face, mingling with the blood. He turned his head frantically toward the altar. He looked directly at Naomi standing resplendent in her white silk wedding gown. He screamed her name with a shattered, desperate voice. He begged her to intervene. He pleaded with her to use the immense Rollins fortune to pay for the best defense attorneys in the country. He swore the federal agents were lying. He swore the entire situation was a complex, elaborate setup designed by me to ruin their perfect love. He swore he was the only man who truly cared about her. Naomi did not flinch. She did not take a single step forward to comfort the man she had planned to marry. She stood perfectly upright beside me, radiating an icy, untouchable calm. She looked at Trent Lawson with absolute, terrifying indifference. She looked at him with the cold, empty stare reserved for a corpse. She possessed no anger. She possessed no sadness. She possessed no pity. He was simply a localized infection that had been successfully excised from her life. The agents grabbed Trent by his torn lapels and dragged him forcefully down the long center aisle toward the exit. Trent kicked and screamed like a terrified child as he passed his horrified, silent family. He kicked and screamed as he was hauled out of the heavy oak doors into the glaring daylight. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, permanently sealing his fate. The initial execution was flawlessly complete, but the ultimate punishment was far from over. The glaring afternoon sunlight struck Trent Lawson violently as the federal agents hauled him through the heavy oak doors of the chapel. He stumbled blindly down the wide granite steps. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled and stained with his own blood. His perfectly polished dress shoes scuffed against the rough stone. The lead FBI agent maintained an iron grip on his handcuffed wrists, pushing him relentlessly toward the waiting line of black federal cruisers parked along the curb. The entire congregation spilled out of the church behind them. Trent's high society friends and arrogant relatives gathered on the portico, staring in muted horror at the public spectacle. They watched the golden boy of the financial district being dragged like a common street criminal. The federal agents reached the bottom of the steps and abruptly halted. A solid, impenetrable wall of broad-shouldered men blocked the sidewalk. Dominic and his heavily armed loan sharks stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a human barricade between the arresting officers and the transport vehicles. The mobsters wore sharp, dark suits that barely concealed the lethal weapons holstered beneath their jackets. They did not move. They did not speak. They simply stared at Trent with the cold, dead eyes of professional predators waiting to collect a long overdue debt. The lead federal agent instinctively reached for his sidearm, recognizing the imminent threat of an organized crime syndicate. The tension on the street spiked into a volatile, dangerous standoff. A heavy silence descended over the stunned wedding guests. Then the wall of muscle shifted. The imposing enforcers seamlessly parted down the middle, creating a narrow, clear path. I walked slowly through the opening. The afternoon sun caught the subtle weave of my bespoke tuxedo. My posture was completely relaxed but radiated an absolute terrifying authority. I stepped onto the pavement and stopped directly in front of the man who had threatened to slit my daughter's throat. The federal agents did not intervene. They understood perfectly well that I was the architect of this entire operation. Trent stared at me. The last remnants of his arrogant facade disintegrated. He was completely surrounded by the law on one side and the ruthless criminal underworld on the other. He finally understood the inescapable magnitude of the trap. Trent's wealthy parents pushed their way through the shocked crowd on the church steps. His father demanded to know what was happening. His mother wept hysterically, clutching her expensive silk shawl. They looked at the federal agents, and then they looked at the intimidating line of mobsters. They finally looked at me. They recognized the humble chauffeur they had openly mocked during the rehearsal dinner. The confusion on their faces was absolute. I did not acknowledge their pathetic outrage. I kept my gaze locked entirely on their ruined son. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored jacket. I withdrew a thick, heavy stack of original promissory notes. The thick parchment papers were bound tightly with a heavy rubber band. They carried the undeniable signatures of Trent Lawson, alongside the brutal, extortionate interest rates of the Chicago syndicate. I raised the stack of documents into the air, letting the bright sunlight illuminate his financial death warrant. I threw the heavy bundle directly at Trent's feet. The papers hit the concrete with a sharp, definitive slap. I spoke with a voice that carried across the entire silent courtyard. I announced to his horrified family and his terrified colleagues that I had purchased every single cent of his illicit debt. I declared that I was now his sole legal and physical creditor. I owned his fraudulent companies. I owned his hidden offshore accounts. I owned the very breath in his lungs. Trent's father staggered backward as the reality of the situation crashed into him. He realized his son did not just owe money to a faceless bank. He realized his son owed millions of dollars to a ruthless billionaire who controlled both the federal authorities and the criminal underworld. The crushing weight of the financial liability meant their own family wealth was completely exposed to ruin. Trent stared at the bundle of promissory notes lying on the pavement. He realized the syndicate was not there to rescue him from the federal agents. The loan sharks were there to ensure he understood the absolute totality of his destruction. He was entirely trapped in a cage I had forged from his own insatiable greed. The walls were closing in and there was absolutely no oxygen left to breathe. The absolute finality of his situation broke Trent Lawson completely. The polished corporate predator vanished, leaving only a weeping, pathetic shell of a man. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of his exposed crimes. He dropped heavily onto the rough concrete of the sidewalk, scraping the fabric of his torn tuxedo pants. The federal agents held his chained arms, keeping him from collapsing entirely onto his face. He began to sob uncontrollably. Thick, heavy tears streamed down his bruised cheeks, mixing with the dirt and the blood. Saliva dripped from his chin. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. He abandoned all pride and all dignity in front of his elite peers. He begged me for mercy. He pleaded with a raspy, shattered voice, swearing he would do anything to make it right. He promised to sign over all his remaining assets. He swore he would disappear and never contact Naomi again. He begged me to call off the federal agents and the mobsters. He pleaded for his life like a cornered rat. I stood perfectly still, watching his public humiliation run its full, agonizing course. The high society guests watched their golden boy grovel in the dirt. I raised my hands slowly and calmly adjusted the platinum cufflinks on my bespoke suit. I smoothed the immaculate fabric of my sleeves. I looked down at him with an expression of pure, absolute ice. I delivered the final verdict. I told him he had judged a man entirely by the uniform he wore. I told him he had mistaken a quiet father for weak prey. I stepped closer, leaning down so my voice would brand itself directly onto his memory. I told him he would now wear a prison uniform for the rest of his miserable life. I signaled the lead federal agent. The officers yanked Trent violently upward, hauling his sobbing, broken form toward the armored cruiser. The heavy steel door opened. They shoved him roughly into the cramped metal cage in the back seat. The door slammed shut with a definitive booming crack that echoed through the quiet city street. The physical execution was complete. The crowd stood in stunned, absolute silence. I turned my back on the police convoy. The transition to his total, relentless legal destruction was now officially underway. 6 months passed before Trent Lawson faced the full devastating weight of the federal justice system. The cavernous courtroom in downtown Chicago was entirely silent. The air conditioning hummed quietly above the gallery where Trent's former high society friends sat in muted horror. Trent sat at the defense table wearing a wrinkled orange prison jumpsuit that starkly contrasted with his previously immaculate tailored suits. His posture was completely defeated. His shoulders slumped forward under the crushing pressure of insurmountable physical evidence. The lead federal prosecutor did not offer a passionate theatrical argument. He delivered a cold clinical dissection of a predator. He projected the high-definition security footage recovered from the subterranean garage directly onto the massive monitors lining the courtroom walls. The silent video clearly displayed Trent violently shoving Naomi against the concrete pillar and brandishing the serrated tactical knife against her throat. The visual evidence of his absolute cowardice was undeniable. The prosecutor followed the assault footage with a meticulous presentation of the forged financial documents. He displayed the falsified signatures, the routed offshore accounts, and the detailed ledger of the stolen corporate funds meant to secure his extortion. He played the crystal-clear audio recordings of Trent bragging to his mistress about discarding Naomi the moment the ink dried on the marriage certificate. Trent's high-priced defense attorney sat completely motionless at the heavy oak table. He did not object. He did not attempt to cross-examine the federal forensic accountants. He did not offer a single word of rebuttal. The attorney understood perfectly well that the case was entirely unwinnable. Trent had provided the federal government with a flawless, uninterrupted roadmap of his own criminal enterprise. The defense attorney simply closed his leather briefcase and looked down at the floor, effectively abandoning his client to the absolute mercy of the court. Trent stared at the polished mahogany table in front of him. The terrifying reality of his situation finally breached his thick, arrogant armor. He was completely stripped of his charm, his wealth, and his manufactured status. He was entirely exposed as a violent, desperate thief. The jury did not even leave the courtroom to deliberate. The sheer volume and absolute clarity of the evidence rendered any discussion entirely unnecessary. They confirmed his absolute guilt across all 27 federal charges. Naomi sat in the center of the front row, observing the total annihilation of the man she had almost married. She wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit that mirrored the unyielding steel she had forged within her own heart over the past 6 months. She did not shed a single tear. She did not avert her gaze when the horrific details of the extortion plot were read aloud to the silent gallery. She watched Trent with the detached clinical interest of a scientist observing a dying parasite. The presiding federal judge adjusted his thick glasses and looked down from his elevated bench. His expression radiated absolute, undisguised disgust. He leaned into his microphone and delivered a scathing, brutal reprimand. He stated that in his 30 years on the federal bench, he had rarely encountered a defendant so entirely devoid of basic human morality. He dismantled Trent's character piece by piece. He highlighted the predatory nature of targeting a woman solely to drain her grandmother's estate. He emphasized the cowardly violence Trent utilized when his intricate financial trap began to fail. The judge declared that Trent had weaponized love and trust, transforming them into tools for massive personal enrichment and psychological terror. He informed the courtroom that such calculated predatory behavior demanded the maximum allowable response from the justice system. Trent began to shake violently in his wooden chair. He squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to look at the judge, refusing to look at his weeping parents sitting 2 rows behind him. The judge did not pause to allow the reality to settle. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. He sentenced Trent Lawson to 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He explicitly stipulated that the sentence would be served entirely without the possibility of parole or early release. The words echoed heavily through the vaulted courtroom, sealing Trent's fate with absolute finality. The golden boy of the financial district would spend the rest of his natural life locked inside a concrete cage. The heavy sentence hung in the quiet air, marking the total, absolute end of his criminal ambition. Naomi simply nodded. The punishment perfectly fit the crime. 2 massive federal marshals immediately stepped forward and hauled Trent violently to his feet. They grabbed his trembling wrists and clamped heavy steel handcuffs securely over his pale skin. The harsh metallic ratcheting sound cut through the quiet murmurs of the stunned courtroom gallery. Trent stumbled as the marshals pushed him toward the heavy wooden side door leading directly to the subterranean holding cells. He dug his cheap canvas prison shoes into the polished floor, fighting for one final moment of delay. He turned his head frantically, scanning the front row until his panicked, bloodshot eyes locked onto Naomi. He ceased his pathetic struggling. He looked at the woman he had completely underestimated and utterly betrayed. His lips trembled as he silently mouthed a desperate, agonizing apology. He formed the words, hoping for a single ounce of the boundless compassion she had previously offered him. He begged for a forgiveness he fundamentally did not deserve. Naomi stood up slowly from the wooden pew. She smoothed the crease of her charcoal trousers. She looked directly into Trent's terrified eyes. She did not offer a comforting smile. She did not offer a nod of understanding. She looked at him as if he were entirely invisible, as if he were a ghost that had already faded from her reality. She turned her back on him completely. She hooked her arm smoothly through mine. The marshals shoved Trent forward, breaking his line of sight. They dragged him through the heavy wooden door into the dark, unforgiving corridors of the federal justice system. The heavy deadbolt slammed shut behind him, permanently erasing Trent Lawson from our world. We walked together down the long center aisle of the courthouse. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing the blinding bright sunlight of the Chicago afternoon. The cold autumn wind rushed over us, carrying the distinct scent of fresh rain and clean pavement. The intricate, sprawling threat that had consumed our lives was entirely neutralized. The villain was permanently gone. I looked at my daughter standing tall and completely unafraid in the harsh daylight. She had survived the absolute worst of human betrayal and emerged forged in unbreakable iron. We stepped down the wide granite stairs together, leaving the courthouse behind. The extortion game was definitively finished, but the sprawling, silent empire I had built still required a master. Father and daughter now had to navigate a completely new reality. The morning sun cut sharply through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Rollins Corporation executive boardroom. A restless sea of financial journalists and corporate stakeholders filled the pristine space. The quiet hum of anticipation vibrated against the polished mahogany walls. I stood behind the heavy glass podium, surveying the empire I had built from nothing. The flashing lights of dozens of cameras reflected off the stark surface of the microphone. I adjusted my posture and commanded the room into absolute silence with a single raised hand. I addressed the gathered press with the calm, measured authority of a man who had weathered every conceivable storm. I announced my formal retirement from the daily operations of the logistics syndicate. A collective murmur rippled through the seasoned reporters as they scrambled to record the monumental shift in global power. I did not pause to allow their frantic speculation to build. I spoke of the future of the company and the absolute necessity of unbreakable, iron-willed leadership. I turned toward the heavy oak doors at the side of the room. Naomi stepped forward into the blinding glare of the media. She wore a perfectly tailored slate gray suit that projected total, uncompromising power. Her posture was flawless. Her expression was forged from the very steel that had crushed Trent Lawson the day before. She walked to the podium with a steady, rhythmic stride that demanded absolute respect from every executive in the room. I stepped aside and yielded the absolute pinnacle of my empire to my only child. Naomi gripped the edges of the glass podium. She looked out over the sea of flashing cameras and cynical journalists. She did not waver. She delivered her opening address with a chilling, crystalline clarity that silenced any remaining doubts about her capability. She articulated a ruthless, brilliant vision for the future of Rollins Logistics. She commanded the room not as my proxy, but as the undisputed master of her own destiny. The transformation was entirely complete. The naive, trusting girl had been burned away by betrayal. The woman standing before the world was a sovereign leader, perfectly equipped to rule the empire. The chaotic energy of the corporate press conference faded into the quiet hum of the late afternoon. I drove the heavy armored SUV away from the towering glass skyscrapers and navigated the familiar route back to the quiet suburban streets. We parked in front of the small rundown house that had served as our elaborate shield for so many years. The late autumn wind rustled through the overgrown oak trees lining the cracked sidewalk. Naomi stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the narrow concrete path. She stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch steps. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the peeling white paint and the weathered wooden siding. She reached out and rested her bare hand against the rough, chipped surface of the supporting pillar. She traced the deep grooves in the wood with quiet reverence. She looked at the sagging gutters and the faded front door. She finally understood the profound, absolute brilliance of this humble sanctuary. This fragile structure had been a deliberate filter designed to separate genuine love from opportunistic greed. Trent Lawson had looked at this house and seen nothing but a miserable trap to escape. He had failed to see the immense value of the people living inside it. Naomi turned to face me as I walked up the driveway. The harsh corporate armor she wore during the press conference softened into a look of profound, absolute gratitude. She looked at the peeling paint and then directly into my eyes. She thanked me for the illusion. She thanked me for creating a world where she could learn the fundamental difference between loyalty and deceit. She thanked me for teaching her that a person's true worth is permanently built on the unyielding foundation of their character and never on the superficial display of brick and mortar. The small suburban house had done its job perfectly. It had exposed a monster and protected a queen. We stood together in the quiet, fading light, honoring the humble facade that had saved her life. The cool evening air began to settle over the quiet suburban neighborhood. I stood on the wooden porch and unbuttoned my immaculate bespoke suit jacket. I slipped the heavy wool garment from my shoulders and draped it carefully over the rusted porch railing. I reached into the canvas duffel bag resting by the front door and pulled out my old, frayed flannel shirt. The fabric was worn soft from years of honest labor. The left sleeve bore the meticulous, reinforced stitching Naomi had sewn by hand when she was just a teenager. I slid my arms into the familiar, comfortable sleeves and buttoned it up against the evening chill. The heavy, suffocating weight of the billionaire persona lifted from my shoulders entirely. I was no longer the ruthless architect of a global logistics empire. I was simply a father standing beside his daughter. We walked in comfortable silence down the cracked driveway toward the heavy black Lincoln parked by the curb. The sleek vehicle gleamed under the flickering glow of the streetlights. I stepped forward and grabbed the polished chrome handle of the rear passenger door. I pulled it open and stepped back exactly as I had done 1,000 times before. I offered her the quiet, dignified service of a humble chauffeur. Naomi stopped on the concrete sidewalk. She looked at the open back door, and then she looked at me. A bright, genuine smile broke across her face. It was the first entirely pure smile I had seen since the extortion nightmare began. She shook her head slowly, rejecting the absolute isolation of the back seat. She reached forward and gently pushed the heavy rear door shut with a solid, definitive click. She walked around the front of the vehicle and opened the passenger door. She slid into the seat directly beside me, claiming her rightful place as an absolute equal. I smiled and climbed behind the steering wheel. I turned the ignition and the powerful engine roared to life with a deep, resonant hum. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. We rolled smoothly down the dark suburban streets, heading back toward the brilliant, towering lights of the city skyline. The storm had finally passed. The empire was secure. Order was permanently restored. The morning sun cut sharply through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Rollins Corporation executive boardroom. A restless sea of financial journalists and corporate stakeholders filled the pristine space. The quiet hum of anticipation vibrated against the polished mahogany walls. I stood behind the heavy glass podium, surveying the empire I had built from nothing. The flashing lights of dozens of cameras reflected off the stark surface of the microphone. I adjusted my posture and commanded the room into absolute silence with a single raised hand. I addressed the gathered press with the calm, measured authority of a man who had weathered every conceivable storm. I announced my formal retirement from the daily operations of the logistics syndicate. A collective murmur rippled through the seasoned reporters as they scrambled to record the monumental shift in global power. I did not pause to allow their frantic speculation to build. I spoke of the future of the company and the absolute necessity of unbreakable, iron-willed leadership. I turned toward the heavy oak doors at the side of the room. Naomi stepped forward into the blinding glare of the media. She wore a perfectly tailored slate gray suit that projected total, uncompromising power. Her posture was flawless. Her expression was forged from the very steel that had crushed Trent Lawson the day before. She walked to the podium with a steady, rhythmic stride that demanded absolute respect from every executive in the room. I stepped aside and yielded the absolute pinnacle of my empire to my only child. Naomi gripped the edges of the glass podium. She looked out over the sea of flashing cameras and cynical journalists. She did not waver. She delivered her opening address with a chilling, crystalline clarity that silenced any remaining doubts about her capability. She articulated a ruthless, brilliant vision for the future of Rollins Logistics. She commanded the room not as my proxy, but as the undisputed master of her own destiny. The transformation was entirely complete. The naive, trusting girl had been burned away by betrayal. The woman standing before the world was a sovereign leader perfectly equipped to rule the empire. The chaotic energy of the corporate press conference faded into the quiet hum of the late afternoon. I drove the heavy armored SUV away from the towering glass skyscrapers and navigated the familiar route back to the quiet suburban streets. We parked in front of the small rundown house that had served as our elaborate shield for so many years. The late autumn wind rustled through the overgrown oak trees lining the cracked sidewalk. Naomi stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the narrow concrete path. She stopped at the bottom of the wooden porch steps. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the peeling white paint and the weathered wooden siding. She reached out and rested her bare hand against the rough, chipped surface of the supporting pillar. She traced the deep grooves in the wood with quiet reverence. She looked at the sagging gutters and the faded front door. She finally understood the profound, absolute brilliance of this humble sanctuary. This fragile structure had been a deliberate filter designed to separate genuine love from opportunistic greed. Trent Lawson had looked at this house and seen nothing but a miserable trap to escape. He had failed to see the immense value of the people living inside it. Naomi turned to face me as I walked up the driveway. The harsh, corporate armor she wore during the press conference softened into a look of profound, absolute gratitude. She looked at the peeling paint and then directly into my eyes. She thanked me for the illusion. She thanked me for creating a world where she could learn the fundamental difference between loyalty and deceit. She thanked me for teaching her that a person's true worth is permanently built on the unyielding foundation of their character and never on the superficial display of brick and mortar. The small suburban house had done its job perfectly. It had exposed a monster and protected a queen. We stood together in the quiet, fading light, honoring the humble facade that had saved her life. The cool evening air began to settle over the quiet suburban neighborhood. I stood on the wooden porch and unbuttoned my immaculate bespoke suit jacket. I slipped the heavy wool garment from my shoulders and draped it carefully over the rusted porch railing. I reached into the canvas duffel bag resting by the front door and pulled out my old frayed flannel shirt. The fabric was worn soft from years of honest labor. The left sleeve bore the meticulous reinforced stitching Naomi had sewn by hand when she was just a teenager. I slid my arms into the familiar comfortable sleeves and buttoned it up against the evening chill. The heavy, suffocating weight of the billionaire persona lifted from my shoulders entirely. I was no longer the ruthless architect of a global logistics empire. I was simply a father standing beside his daughter. We walked in comfortable silence down the cracked driveway toward the heavy black Lincoln parked by the curb. The sleek vehicle gleamed under the flickering glow of the streetlights. I stepped forward and grabbed the polished chrome handle of the rear passenger door. I pulled it open and stepped back exactly as I had done 1,000 times before. I offered her the quiet, dignified service of a humble chauffeur. Naomi stopped on the concrete sidewalk. She looked at the open back door, and then she looked at me. A bright, genuine smile broke across her face. It was the first entirely pure smile I had seen since the extortion nightmare began. She shook her head slowly, rejecting the absolute isolation of the back seat. She reached forward and gently pushed the heavy rear door shut with a solid, definitive click. She walked around the front of the vehicle and opened the passenger door. She slid into the seat directly beside me, claiming her rightful place as an absolute equal. I smiled and climbed behind the steering wheel. I turned the ignition and the powerful engine roared to life with a deep, resonant hum. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. We rolled smoothly down the dark suburban streets, heading back toward the brilliant, towering lights of the city's skyline. The storm had finally passed. The empire was secure. Order was permanently restored. True power does not shout from penthouse suites or demand attention through expensive fabric. It operates silently in the background, testing the integrity of those who seek to enter your life. A humble facade acts as the ultimate filter against greed, revealing the true nature of predators who value wealth over humanity. We must remember that character remains the only currency that never depreciates. Do you agree that testing a person's loyalty is absolutely necessary before giving them your trust? Share your thoughts in the comments below, subscribe to our channel for more stories, and never compromise your core values.